Diamond Syndicate by Nicholas Carter. Chapter 1. A Dark Night's Work. Your uncle murdered? It seems incredible. Nick Carter leaned back in his chair and looked at his visitor, dismay showing in his face. It is too true, old friend. Uncle Alvin was murdered in his bed last night, and diamonds to the value of $500,000 stolen from the house. The speaker, Charlie Maynard, was greatly excited. He was a young man who had arrived at legal age only a few months before. Almost from boyhood he had been a friend of the man of whom he now sought sympathy and advice. $500,000 in diamonds! Echoed the detective. I was not aware that Alvin Maynard possessed diamonds to that value. They were mine, replied the young man. The day is full of surprises, said Nick. When and how did you become owner of such a wonderful collection of precious stones? They were delivered to me yesterday, at the residence of my uncle, up the Hudson, replied Charlie. I hardly wish I had never set eyes on them. A present? Asked Nick. My inheritance from my father, was the reply. As you know, he was a globe-trotter from his youth up. It seems that during a visit to South Africa, he became the possessor of the gems which were stolen last night. How he came by them, I have no idea. I only know that there are some very fine stones in the collection, and that they were delivered to me yesterday afternoon. Now they are gone. My uncle lies dead in the house. My aunt is prostrated with grief, besides suffering severely from a blow dealt by a brutal assassin, and my cousin, Anton Sawtell, lies wounded in his bed. It is a sad house this morning, Mr. Carter. There was a struggle, then? Asked Nick. The robbers were discovered at their work and fought for the booty? That is the strangest part of the case, said the young man. The diamonds were stolen from a trunk in my room on the second floor of the house, and yet I heard nothing of the struggle which must have taken place. It seems that the burglars entered by way of Anton's room and searched the entire floor. Why they should have visited the apartments of my uncle and aunt is more than I can understand. I am not a heavy sleeper, yet I heard nothing of the affair until this morning. Was no one able to give the alarm until this morning? Asked Nick. Where were the servants? Surely they must have been aroused. They were not, was the reply, and the first intimation I had of the murder of my uncle and the loss of my diamonds was when informed by Anton of the happenings of the night. Nick walked the floor of his room for a moment. What did Anton tell you? He finally asked. He said that he heard a noise during the night and arose from his bed. As he stepped out in the direction of the door opening into the hall, he was struck a savage blow, from the effects of which he did not recover until after daylight. And your aunt? She, too, says that she heard a noise and stepped to the door of her chamber. It was dark in the hallway, but her figure was outlined against a window in the wall at her back. While standing there, listening, she was struck on the forehead and rendered unconscious until morning. And you were asleep on that floor? Yes, sir, directly across the hall from the room occupied by my aunt. Uncle slept in a room at the front of the house, Anton in a room at the rear. The two rooms between these were occupied by my aunt and myself, as I have already stated. The diamonds were in your trunk? Yes, sir. Was the trunk locked? No, sir, it was not. You see, we have never been molested before up there. I was not as cautious as I might have been. However, if the trunk had been locked, it would have been all the same, I imagine. You might have been awakened by the forcing of the lock, said the detective. It is strange that you did not hear the sound of the blows which killed your uncle and left your aunt unconscious. I wonder at that, said the young man, for I am not usually a heavy sleeper. But I hope you can come out to the house at once. The sheriff and 2 deputies are there, but no one save the coroner has been admitted to the second floor. Can you come now? Certainly, was the reply. And another thing, said the young man, hesitation in his voice. I wish you to act as my personal representative in the search for the diamonds. This may seem to you a selfish request, with the murder of my uncle still at large, but it is a matter of great importance to me. The diamonds constitute my sole inheritance from my father. Nothing can bring my uncle back to life, but the diamonds, recovered, will make my future life both useful and happy. Besides, the recovery of the diamonds must point to the murderer." "That does not necessarily follow," replied Nick. "However, I will do the best I can for you. You were at your uncle's yesterday afternoon?" "Yes. I have been stopping there for a month at his special request." "When and where were the diamonds delivered to you?" "At uncle's at 3:00. They were brought up from the city by a special messenger, who took a receipt and returned on the first train south." "When did you open the package containing the diamonds?" "Immediately." "Where did you open them?" "In the parlor on the first floor." "Who was present?" "Uncle, aunt, Anton, Bernice, aunt's maid, and myself." "Anton is your cousin by marriage only?" "He is a son of my aunt by a first marriage." "I see. Where was he born?" "In Paris. He has lived there nearly all his life." "Were there any servants about when the diamonds were shown? Did the servants see the diamonds at all?" "No, sir." "Was the arrival of the gems talked of before the servants?" "To some extent, yes." "You were about the grounds in the afternoon?" "Yes, sir. I remember now that I sat on the side porch a long time, looking over the lawn and garden on that side of the house." "You observed no strangers about?" "No, sir. Say, 2 men came up from the station and passed the house shortly after the departure of the messenger who had delivered the diamonds. They passed on about 200 yards, and then turned toward the depot. I did not see them again." "What sort of appearing men were they?" "I remember now that their dress and manner gave me the impression that they were sailors." "The sheriff has charge of the case, I presume?" "Sheriff Walton is there in person. He was notified quite early this morning at Anton's request." "What direction is his investigation taking?" "He has made a study of the grounds, and was at the railroad station when I came away, questioning the agent and the night watchman, who had been sent for." "I am glad he has been kept out of the house," said the detective. "I can't get the thing through my head," said the young man. "1 man murdered, 2 persons assaulted and left unconscious, my own room entered and robbed, and I the only one on the floor not aroused by the noise. It seems a strange case." "Now about the murder of your uncle," said Nick. "How was the death wound inflicted?" "He was struck on the temple with some blunt instrument. He was in his pajamas and lying across the bed when found. It looks as if he had arisen to a sitting position when awakened, and was then seized by the throat. There are marks as though a struggle had taken place." "And your aunt?" "There is a cut over the left eye." "Not a serious one?" "Oh, no. It is difficult, however, to imagine what sort of a weapon made the cut. It seems to be 3-cornered." "And Anton?" "There is no question but that he was struck with a pair of iron knuckles. The wound shows that plainly enough." Nick remained silent for some moments. He was puzzling over the fact that the gems had been so soon located in the house by the thieves. "By whom were the diamonds delivered?" he finally asked. "By a messenger from the American Express office." "Who paid the duty?" "The express company." "It must have been a heavy one." "It was," answered the young man. "It took all my little fortune." Nick entered the telephone booth and called up the American Express office. In a few moments he learned that the diamonds had arrived in New York the previous day at noon on an ocean liner, and that they had remained in charge of the company only an hour before the departure of the messenger. No one in the employ of the company, except the man who had paid the duty and the manager, knew of the valuable contents of the package. While the detective was puzzling over the case, Chick entered and was soon in possession of its main features as known to his chief. "Where were the diamonds shipped from?" he asked. "Originally from Cape Town," replied the young man, "but direct from Liverpool." Chick looked at his chief with a smile on his face. "It is a pretty case, I imagine," he said. "The gems must have been followed from Cape Town." "Well, in that case," said young Maynard, The man who did the following made quick work of it after they arrived in this country. Of course, the route to the hiding place of the murderer must be discovered by tracing the diamonds. Don't you think so?" he added, turning to Nick. "It will, I think, prove easier to find the murderer than the diamonds," said Nick. "The gems may be passed on from hand to hand, or separated and scattered to the end of the world, while the murderer cannot have his crime with anyone." Nick ordered his automobile, and the three were soon on their way to the country house on the Hudson where the murder had been committed. When they reached their destination, they found a crowd of curious suburbanites gathered about the gate, which had been closed and locked by the sheriff. The house stood some distance from the road in a grove of elm trees. A handsomely kept lawn swept down to the iron fence which shut in the grounds. It was a fine old mansion, with many gables, porches, and odd corners. The dull red walls were overrun with English ivy. The detectives ascended at once to the upper floor. The stairs brought them to a long hallway, running just west of the tier of rooms at the front of the house. Entering the front room, they found the body of the dead man lying on the bed. Nick at once bent over it. His impression was that it had been placed on the bed after the death blow had been struck, but the coroner had gone away for a time, and he could ask no questions of him. "It is worth looking up," thought Nick. As the detectives were beginning their work, Sheriff Walton called out to them from the lower hallway. "I am going away for a time," he said, "but I'll be back. 2 suspicious men took a rig from a local stable last night, and have not returned it. I think that perhaps they are the men who were here. You will find that the burglars gained entrance by way of the west room, and passed on to the front of the house. On the way, they got the diamonds from the trunk in Charlie's room." Nick smiled as the sheriff closed the door and took his departure. "He seems to have solved the case already," said Chick. "I presume he has the murderer in sight now. Good luck to him, say I." "Here's something to begin on," continued Chick, pointing to footprints in the hallway. "See, there's been a good deal of travel about here, and in bare feet. I don't quite understand this, Chief. I can't see what it means. We have been told that Mrs. Maynard and Anton lay unconscious until morning, so I don't see who did all this walking about. I don't believe people came up here barefooted." The prints of naked feet led from door to door, and in some places were quite numerous. They passed from the north room to the south room, back again, and from the east room to the north room and back again. The south room was occupied by the owner of the diamonds, the north room by his aunt, and the east room by Alvin Maynard, who lay dead there at the time of the visit. West of the doors of the side rooms, which were exactly opposite each other, the hall was narrower and led only to a west room, occupied by Anton Sawtell. The marks here were not those of naked feet. The person in the stockings seemed to have made 2 trips to the front room. The other marks might have been made after the discovery of the crimes of the night. One thing about the stocking marks struck the detective as peculiar. In each instance, the outgoing marks were close together, the incoming marks far apart. "This chap was in a mighty hurry coming back," said Chick reflectively. "He made the return trips in long jumps. Must have got scared in the front room." "Anton might have visited his father's room before dressing," said Nick, "and discovered the dead body on the bed. That would naturally give him a fright." "But he seems to have gotten 2 frights," said Chick, with a grin. As Chick bent over the tracks, Nick moved cautiously toward the front of the hall. He was certain that he heard footsteps there, that someone was watching their movements, noting the course their investigation was taking. Finally he made a little rush to the front, and was just in time to see a mass of dark hair disappearing down the stairs. The wearer of the hair looked back, and Nick saw a pair of handsome black eyes. "We were watched," he mused, turning back to the tracks. "The burglars, we are told, entered by way of Anton's room." The detectives passed down the hall and entered the rear room after it had been unlocked from the inside. The young man who had unlocked the door was already back in bed when the detectives entered. His head was bandaged and his face was pale as death. His eyes glared unnaturally from under heavy brows. He was a remarkably handsome man, although his face, even with the pallor of suffering upon it, showed signs of dissipation. His features were regular, his hair black and waving, and his figure slender and muscular. "I called to you when you were at the door a moment ago," he said, "but you did not answer. I presume you are Nick Carter?" "Yes." "Well, I'm glad to see you. Hope you will find the murderer, and also the brute who gave me this bump on the head. My poor father! He was always a father to me." "All in good time," said Nick. "We are about to make an examination of the premises, but would like to ask you a few questions, provided you are well enough to engage in conversation." "I am very much better," was the reply, "and perfectly able to tell you all I know about this wretched affair." "What time did you go to bed last night?" was the first question. "About 10 o'clock," was the reply. "We keep early hours up here in the country, you see," he added, with a wan smile. "Did you retire for the night as soon as you came upstairs? What I mean is, did you move about your room or the hall?" Sawtell's face became flushed, and he hesitated. Although Nick's eyes were seemingly not fixed on his face, he noted every change of expression. What Nick appeared to be looking at was the gravel roof of a one-story lean-to attached to the building at the west. Chapter 2. Conflicting Clues. Once the young man opened his lips to reply to the question, but he changed his mind, evidently, and remained silent for a time. "Give me time to think," he said, after a pause. "I don't seem to remember. Did you come up here before your mother and Mr. Maynard came up for the night?" "Oh, yes, I heard them come up and go to their rooms." "Did they engage in conversation?" "They did not," was the hesitating reply. "To tell the truth, they were not on good terms with each other last night. That makes this affair all the more terrible for mother. Do you know the nature of their quarrel?" "I do not." "Did you leave your room for any purpose after they came up here?" "I did not." "Until when?" "This morning." "Then you went to Mr. Maynard's room?" "I went to mother's room first. You see, I had been attacked, and my first idea on regaining consciousness was that someone else might have been wounded." "That was quite early?" "Just after daylight." "Where did you find your mother?" "Lying on the floor. I placed her on the bed and went on to Mr. Maynard's room. I found him dead, as you know." "Did you move the body?" "I did not." This with a shudder of horror. "Were you dressed?" "I was not. I had just tumbled off the bed where I had fallen, or been thrown by the robbers. I think I had my trousers and socks on. That is all. You must understand that about this time I was hardly myself, and was laboring under strong excitement. I hardly know what I did after that. I remember of going to Charlie's room, and of hearing him cry out that the diamonds had been stolen. You know I had lain in an unconscious condition all night from this wound on my head. I asked that Sheriff Alton be sent for, and again became unconscious." "Did you succeed in arousing your mother from her stupor?" "I called to the servants to assist her." "How was she dressed?" "In a night robe." "How about her feet?" "They were bare." "Where was she taken then?" "Directly downstairs." "She was not able to walk about?" "Oh, no, she was carried down." Young Sawtell closed his eyes as if from weariness, and, quick as a flash, Nick lifted something from under the edge of the bed and thrust it into his pocket. "Now about the burglars," said the detective. "Do you know about what time it was when they entered?" "I have no idea." "What was the first sound you heard?" "I thought I heard a window rattle, and arose to a sitting position." "And then?" "I could see that there was some one in the room, and I sprang out of bed to get a revolver which I keep in the closet." "You did not reach the closet?" "No. I met an iron knuckle and dropped to the floor." "Did you visit the closet at all last night?" "No, I'm sure that I did not." "You caught no parting glimpse of the intruder's face?" "No. There were two. How do you know that?" "I could see two forms outlined against the window." "You heard them moving about the room?" "Only for a moment." "Did they make much noise in moving about?" "Very little." Nick now turned to the windows opening on the roof of the lean-to to the west. The structure was covered with a gravel roof, and during the rain of the night of the murder, little pools of water had formed. Into these sand had been swept. Nick examined every one of these closely. In a moment he called Chick to his side. "Here is the autograph of one of the burglars," he said, pointing to an impression in one sandy pocket of the roof. "Rubber shoes," said Chick. "Exactly. With a tear in the sole of the right shoe, it ought to be easy enough to follow this fellow." Chick made a circuit of the little roof and came back to his chief. "The cut in the shoe which shows there," he said, "was made after the robber got to the roof. The tin strap which supports the eave trough at the west, where the ladder was raised, is broken, and Mr. Burglar stepped on the sharp, upturned edge." Nick descended the ladder, which remained as the robbers had left it, and walked around the grounds for a few moments, after which he returned to the west room. "They came from the orchard," he said, "and after the rain." "The rain fell at 2:00, said Chick. Nick turned to Sawtell. "It is your notion that you were knocked down as soon as the thieves entered the room?" he asked. "Of course." "Isn't it remarkable that Charlie was not awakened?" "He is a heavy sleeper." "What did he say in the morning?" "I don't remember." The young man was becoming nervous and impatient, and Nick and his assistant left the room, first asking permission to return later and search for further traces of the burglars. In 5 minutes' time, however, the young man passed them in the hall and went downstairs. The detectives looked at each other in silence for a moment. "He lies," said Chick. "Mr. and Mrs. Maynard did walk in the hall last night, after they were ready for bed, and he knows it, for he was not asleep. I say he was not asleep because he came out after them. Notice that the marks leading from his door are over the ones made by naked feet, and were therefore made last." "That looks all right on the face of it," replied Nick, "but he says he passed through the hall this morning." "I overlooked that point," said Chick. "But, anyhow, he lied about the old people not moving about." "He might have been asleep," said Nick. "Don't jump at conclusions, my son." Chick bent over the floor. "What is it?" asked Nick. "I am looking for the marks made by the burglars in passing from the rear room to the front one," was the reply. An inscrutable smile appeared on the face of the detective. "Look sharply," he said. "Perhaps you may be able to find what you are looking for." Chick arose and faced his chief with excitement showing in his manner. "They are not here," he said. "What does it mean?" "There are the marks of the stocking feet," suggested Nick. "But these two sets of tracks are the same," said the assistant, "and were, of course, made by Anton. You have, I think, the socks he wore last night in your pocket," added Chick with a smile. "Suppose we compare them with the tracks." "You saw what I took from under the bed, then?" "Certainly. I had had my eyes on them for some time." Nick took the socks from his pocket. They fitted the tracks exactly. "You see," said Chick, "the burglars never left that back room. Now, who murdered Alvin Maynard? Who stole Charlie Maynard's diamonds?" What Chick stated was the truth. There was no indication that the burglars had left the threshold of Anton's room, and yet the old man had been murdered at the other end of the hall, and the diamonds had been stolen from a room which could be reached only by way of the hall. Nick made no reply. Instead, he turned from the hall and entered the room from which the gems had been stolen. Everything was in order there. The diamonds had been taken from a trunk, and this stood near the head of the bed, the cover swung back against the wall. In the compartment at the right end of the till was a casket, the one in which, under coarser covering, the diamonds had been shipped to New York. Nick took out his glass and inspected the packing. Then he placed some of the cotton and some of the paper in his pocketbook. The trunk was of metal surface, and at the top of the box the iron had been worn through to the wood. Jagged edges of metal showed all along the edge of the box. On one of these edges Nick found a shred of pink wool, which he placed in his pocket with the other articles. Nick now entered the room which had been occupied by Mrs. Maynard, going directly to the dresser. "What do you find?" asked Chick. "Record of last night's proceedings," was the reply. "It is as plain as if written in ink. I have heard it said," continued the detective, "that no person can enter a room without leaving some evidence of the visit. This may be putting it too strongly, but I am convinced that no person can commit a crime without leaving behind the record of the deed, as plain as printing, if only we know how to read the language in which it is written." "That has often been proven," said Chick. The little right-hand drawer of the dresser stood half open, disclosing a collection of rumpled handkerchiefs of fine texture. The top of the dresser was half covered with toilet articles. There were powders and liquid preparations for the face and hands, and many other articles designed to keep the marks of advancing years from showing too plainly. Nick picked up a jar of yellowish paste and turned his glass on it. Then he took the piece of packing from his pocket. "See here," he said. "The woman went to Charlie's room last night, after all was still in the house, and took the diamonds and brought them to this room." "Impossible!" cried Chick. "That silver-haired old lady a thief? Never!" "I did not say that she stole the gems," said Nick. "I said that she brought them to this room. First, how do I know that she took them from the trunk? Notice this jar of toilet paste. When she got ready for bed she used that on her hands and face, a common thing for women to do. Then, after her light was out, and after Charlie was in bed and asleep, she entered his room and took the diamonds from the casket." Chick listened, with wonder showing in his eyes. "I presume you know where all this points?" he said. "I know that she extinguished the light before she left her room, because she groped her way in the darkness and felt along the door for the knob. She left traces of this toilet paste on the panels. She did the same thing in Charlie's room, groped her way in the darkness. More traces of the toilet paste on the door and on the trunk. This shows that Charlie was not only in bed, but asleep. Lastly, she left traces of the paste on the packing from which she removed the gems." "Poor old woman!" said Chick. "Wait a moment," said Nick. "There is no knowing what her motive was. She brought the diamonds here and placed them in that little drawer at the right of the dresser. See, some of the packing clung to them, and it is still in the drawer." "It seems to be a clear case," said Chick. "But the diamonds did not remain in the drawer for any length of time," said Nick. "Did you know Alvin Maynard in his lifetime?" The assistant shook his head. "Then you do not know what an inveterate snuff taker he was. Well, he came in here last night, after the return of his wife, and removed the gems from that drawer. His fingers were soiled with snuff at the time, and he left traces of it on the handkerchiefs in the drawer. The handkerchiefs are also crumpled, showing that the diamonds were not taken out in a calm manner." "I see," said Chick, more surprised than ever. Nick now went to the old lady's closet, which opened from the sleeping room, and came out with a pink night-robe thrown over his shoulder. He attempted no explanation until they both stood in the front room, by the side of the bed whereon the dead man lay. "It is certain that the old lady followed her husband to this room," Nick said. "Then and that a quarrel took place here. Observe how the gathers are torn out at the neck of this night-robe. It all ended in her being pushed down or falling in a faint. At any rate, the woman received her wound in this room, and not in the doorway of her own chamber, from the fist of a burglar, as she is said to claim." Nick walked over to a couch which stood by a front window. The head of the couch was composed of a straight, sharp-cornered piece of quarter-sawed oak, without upholstery of any kind on the edge. On the outer corner of his headpiece was a bruise and a stain of blood. "It looks to me," said Chick, "as if the burglary was a put-up job. and that the diamonds are still in the possession of some member of the Maynard family. Why, for instance, should the old lady lie about the way in which she received her wound, if all is on the level here?" Nick smiled and pointed to the couch. "No woman," he said, "would admit a quarrel with her husband, much less a blow. It is therefore easy to understand why she lays the wound to the burglar. Besides, the diamonds she handled last night have been stolen, and it would be indiscreet for her to admit having them in her possession, even for a minute, just before the robbery. And, then, there is the murder. It is hard to believe that any member of the family would murder the old man." Nick turned to the bed again and regarded the body carefully. "The blow which killed Maynard," he said, "was not delivered while he lay or sat on the bed. The body was placed there after the blow was struck, and what blood came from the fatal wound was wiped away. We ought to find traces of that somewhere here." "There you are!" cried Chick. "No burglar would stop to place a victim on the bed, or to wipe away the blood. Now, how is your theory?" "The woman was revived here," said Nick, "for this night robe is still damp, so her son did not find her unconscious in her room this morning, as he claims." "I wonder how Anton got along with his stepfather?" asked Chick. "They never had any trouble that I know of," replied Nick. "It is my notion," said Chick, "that, as you say, the woman was revived in this room, and also that she witnessed the murder. Yet, according to all accounts, she says nothing of it, which is unnatural, unless it is true that the murderer is known to her and entitled to her protection. And, another thing, both Anton and his mother know more about the doings of last night than they are willing to admit, and they will remain under suspicion in my mind until several points are cleared up." Nick made no reply. There was a lot of sense in what his assistant said, and yet he was not ready to admit the truth of his deductions. He returned to Anton's room and entered the closet, which the young man had stated he had not visited the night before. While Nick searched in the closet, Chick remained by the outer door leading into the hall. Presently he heard soft steps at the front of the building. Whoever was moving about there was doing so with attempt at secrecy. As the assistant stood listening, the rustle of skirts was added to the sound of the footsteps. The steps seemed to enter the east room, where the body lay, to return to the hall, pass into Charlie's room, across into the old lady's room. Nick came to the door of the closet and pointed toward the hall. "Watch there," he said. "You know a girl came up here a little while ago and ducked away as soon as discovered. This may be the same one." Chick darted down the hall and entered the old lady's room. Standing in the middle of the floor, there he saw a rather pretty girl, with black hair and eyes and regular features. She was tall and slender, and seemed to be about 20 years of age. She curtsied and blushed as Chick entered the room. "What do you want here?" asked Chick. "You are the famous Nick Carter?" asked the girl, speaking in French, a language which Chick understood perfectly. "Why are you here?" continued Chick. "And why were you here a short time ago?" "I was not here a short time ago," was the reply, "and I come now at the command of my mistress." "Why should you say I was here a short time ago, when I have been with my sick mistress all morning?" Chapter 3 Covering Clues "And your mistress is Mrs. Maynard?" asked Chick. "Of a certainty." Chick saw that the girl was antagonistic, but he did not show what his thoughts were. The only way to secure information from the girl would be to make friends with her. He asked: "How is Mrs. Maynard this morning?" "She is very ill, sir." "It is a terrible affair," said Chick. "It is a wonder that all the people in the house were not murdered in their beds." "I shall be afraid to stay here now," said the girl, still speaking in French. "You surely are not going away?" asked Chick. "What will Mrs. Maynard do? She surely can't get a companion like you, young, devoted, and attractive, every day." The girl blushed prettily. The flattery was winning its way, seemingly. "I must go about my work," said the girl. "I have to take to my mistress some of her clothes from the closet." "Can I assist you?" asked Chick. "Oh, no. It is only a few I carry." The girl went to the closet. Chick watched her every move and glance. Entering the closet, she looked anxiously about. She seemed disappointed at not finding something she sought. Passing her hand swiftly along the line of garments suspended on hooks, the girl turned them out from the wall and looked behind them. "You are looking for something?" asked Chick. "For a dress," was the reply. "It is not here." "Ah!" Standing in the doorway of the closet, the girl's eyes now fell on the pink nightrobe, lying on the bed where Nick had tossed it. The girl stepped briskly forth and seized the robe, doubling it up and hiding as much of it from view as was possible. And yet she claimed to be looking for a dress, thought Chick. Here is mistake number 1 for us. We should have hidden that nightrobe. I presume the woman will see that we do not get it in our hands again. Rather bright girl, this. I wish Nick would happen in here just now." As if in answer to the thought, Nick appeared in the doorway. Chick saw that his chief had sized up the situation at a glance. The girl curtsied to the new arrival and moved off with the robe under her arm. Nick watched her from the doorway as she passed along the hall toward the front of the house. When she came to the cross hall, directly in front of the room which had been occupied by the dead man, she dropped the robe to the floor. Instead of picking it up at once, she, with a little exclamation of impatience, gave it a push with her foot, which sent it along the floor, not towards the stairs, but to the south, down the hall which ran straight from the head of the stairs to a wing of the house, the upper floor of which was occupied by the servants as sleeping rooms. Nick stepped quickly forward, but the girl was pushing the robe along with her foot, and the dust on the linoleum was brushed aside, obliterating any marks which might have been there. The detective smiled at the strategy displayed. The hall down which the girl passed was not a long one, and ended at a door which connected with a hall in the wing. She was, therefore, soon out of sight. As she closed the door, Nick saw a disdainful smile on her face. "That's a bright girl," he said, as Chick stepped to his side. "Mrs. Maynard is covering clues," said the assistant, "which shows that she has much to conceal. The girl said she came after a dress, but went away with a nightrobe which discloses the story of the struggle. She was in Charlie's room before she came here. I wonder what she took from there." Nick stepped down the hall a few paces and bent to the floor. When he came back he held a shred of cotton in his fingers. "She took the packing from the casket in which the diamonds were brought here," he said. "Mrs. Maynard is getting well fast. The robe shows the struggle, and the packing shows her touch. But she came too late." Chick drew the little drawer from the dresser and held it out. Empty. "And the handkerchiefs show the presence of the diamonds here, and also the grab made for them by the old man. She must have taken them before I got into the room, although I was only a second behind her. What does it all mean, Chief? Is it possible that Mrs. Maynard knows who killed her husband?" Nick made no reply. He stood in the hallway looking down at a footprint left in the dust by the girl. He ended by taking a tape from his pocket and measuring it. Then he went to the door at the south end of the front hall and turned the knob. The door was locked, but he had it open in a moment. No one was in sight as he glanced down the hall in the wing. He stepped inside and tried the door to the front room. It, too, was locked, but was soon opened with his picklock. One glance at the interior showed the detective that it was the room occupied by the maid. It was in perfect order, except that the robe, just taken from the other part of the house, lay across the back of a chair, and the handkerchiefs, just taken from the dresser of her mistress, lay on the bed. So Mrs. Maynard had not really regained them, after all. Well, thought the detective, she may have ordered the girl to get them out of sight. It is a wonder to me that she did not think of that sooner. We should have been all at sea had she ordered that floor swept early this morning. Nick went to where his assistant stood and announced that he had about concluded his work there. "What did you find in the closet?" Chick asked. Nick did not reply immediately. He seemed to be in one of his brooding moods. He walked back to the rear room again and stood at the closet door with his measuring tape in his hands. Again he went to the room where the dead man lay, and studied the position of the body and the character of the wound which had resulted in instant death. Once more he went over the hall, leading to the door of the west room, this time using a glass on every inch of it. Chick, standing at the door of Charlie's room, heard him mutter, "It isn't possible. I surely must be mistaken. And yet here it is, in black and red, literally. It is too brutal to be true. Too brutal. Too unnatural." Chick pondered over the words for a long time. Nick was not much given to talking his thoughts aloud, and Chick knew that he must be greatly moved to do so now. But Chick knew that his chief had made some discovery which he did not care to communicate, because of his uncertainty as to its bearing on the case. "It's an odd case," said Nick presently. "We can only trace the stolen gems to members of the family, and there is the murder." "But in terror of discovery," said Chick, "is it not possible that even a member of the family might have dealt the blow which killed the old man?" Nick made no reply. He walked down the hall leading to the servants' quarters, and examined the floor both at the door and near it. The cunning maid had swept the floor clean along the path of travel with the robe, but Nick continued his investigations along the walls, where the robe had not touched. At last he turned away and, accompanied by his assistant, passed down the stairs and entered the parlor on the floor below. There they found Charlie awaiting their arrival. Nick closed the door which communicated with other parts of the house and asked, "How long has the maid been here?" Charlie smiled. "Don't waste your time there," he said. "She came from Paris with Aunt 10 or more years ago, and is devoted to the family." "When was your aunt married to Mr. Maynard?" was the next question. "About 10 years ago. They met first in Paris." "Then the maid was with your aunt before the marriage?" "I think so. She is more of a companion than a maid, though." "How long has Anton lived here?" "About a year." "And before that time?" "He lived in Paris." "Supported by your aunt?" "I think so." "Has she an income of her own?" "A very small one. She lost most of it when she remarried." "I see. Is Anton to remain here? What I mean is, was it his purpose on coming here to remain in this country?" Charlie laughed uneasily. "There was nothing else for him to do," he said. "He could no longer live on the money he was receiving, and so he had to go to work or come here." "Ah! And he did not like the idea?" "He did not." "And the maid? She also longs for Paris?" "Oh, you are off the track," said Charlie. "They do not get on well when together, and the girl would not leave Aunt. There is nothing in that line." "You think they have a mutual dislike for each other?" asked Nick, with a smile. "I am certain of it." "How long since this began to show?" "Well, they were shy of each other from the first. Lately they have quarreled in the presence of the servants." "Only lately?" "Only lately," repeated Charlie. "They knew each other in Paris?" "Yes, I think so, when they were children." "Now, how has Anton been supplied with money since he came here?" "By my aunt." "Has he ever complained of the size of the allowance?" "Not that I am aware of, but he has borrowed of me." "And repaid?" "Never." There was silence for a moment, and then Nick asked, "Was it generally known in the house that the diamonds were coming?" "Yes. The matter was often talked of." Again there was a long pause. "Oh, say," said Charlie presently, "you may as well give up that line of inquiry. We know well enough how the thieves got into the house, and how they got the gems. You see, they left plenty of clues behind. The sheriff thinks he has them located already. What have you discovered?" The detective had no idea of reporting progress at that time, so he ignored the question and asked for Mrs. Maynard. "She is too ill to be seen," said Charlie. "And the maid is with her? By the way, what is the name of the maid?" "Her name is Bernice. Yes, she is with my aunt." "Is Mrs. Maynard still unconscious?" asked Chick. Only partially so, was the reply. She is in a low condition physically, and the shock of last night has affected her seriously." "You have called a physician?" "Of course." As the question was answered, the physician made his appearance in the parlor. He was old and gray, and had long been in attendance on the family. "How are your patients?" asked Charlie. "Mr. Sawtell is so far improved as to be able to take the air in the orchard," was the reply, "but Mrs. Maynard is not satisfactorily recovering from the shock." "Is she suffering pain?" asked Charlie. "I think not. The trouble seems to be a mental one. I fear for her reason if there is not a change almost immediately." "Bernice is with her?" asked Charlie. "She was until a moment ago," was the reply. Then she called one of the servants and left the house. Nick and Chick exchanged glances, and the latter almost immediately left the parlor, taking the direction of the orchard as soon as he was out of the house. Passing along the south side of the house, Chick came to a barrier of evergreens which shut out a view of the orchard from the front. Away to the left, however, there was a gate, and the detective turned toward it. As he moved along he heard voices on the other side of the hedge. He could not distinguish the words, but the voices were those of Anton and Bernice. Chick passed through the gate and walked around the rear of the house to the place where the ladder had been lifted to the roof of the lean-to, hoping to see the couple on the way. However, the voices ceased, and the young people were nowhere in sight. The doctor quitted the parlor shortly after Chick's departure, and thus left alone with Charlie, Nick asked: "You said this morning that you are a light sleeper. How did you rest last night? Were you in your usual health when you awoke?" "No," was the reply. "I had a frightful headache, and my stomach was in bad shape. It is seldom that I awake in bad condition. Perhaps I slept too soundly." "Did you partake of food or drink after supper last night?" asked Nick. Charlie looked the surprise he did not express. "Yes," he said in a moment. "It was a hot night, and we had ice cream and lemonade in the parlor." "Who suggested it?" "I think I did." "Who prepared it?" "Some one in the kitchen." "Who served it?" "Bernice." "How long did you remain awake after partaking of the cream and lemonade?" "Not very long. I was tired, and soon became sleepy and went off to bed." Nick walked the floor for a moment. "I know what your questions mean," said Charlie excitedly. "You think I was drugged last night." Nick made no reply. "I had thought of that," continued Charlie, "because of my unusual sleep, but had rejected the notion because every member of the family partook of the refreshments which were served, and because the suspicion seemed to point to some member of the family as the burglar and the murderer." "Never mind that now," said Nick. "Did you see much of Anton last night?" "Yes, he was with me until I retired." "And Bernice?" "She was with my aunt in the sitting room the greater part of the evening." "You do not know whether she retired early?" "Of course not. She usually does go to bed as soon as my aunt releases her from duty for the night, and aunt went to her room early last evening, before I did, in fact. Anton was the only one in the parlor when I left." "Where was Bernice?" asked Nick. "She was somewhere about the house. I remember now that aunt did not require her services in her chamber." "She might have been in bed?" "No, she was not, for I heard her voice downstairs just before I left for my room. She was somewhere at the back of the house." "What time did Mr. Maynard go to his room?" asked Nick. "He was there most of the evening. He had what the boys call a grouch about something, I guess." "Where were the diamonds during the evening?" "In my trunk." Nick pondered a moment and turned away, going to the door, from which he turned back to ask: "Were the diamonds in your trunk when you went to bed?" Charlie laughed. "No doubt of that," he said. "I looked at them." Nick walked to and fro on the lawn until Chick came up. "You found Bernice in consultation with Anton, I presume," he said. "Yes, they were in the orchard together." "You could not hear their talk?" Chick shook his head. The county physician who served as coroner was now summoned and the body placed at his disposal. "I am sorry to have delayed you in your work so long," Nick said, "but I did not want to miss any possible clues by having it removed before a thorough examination of the room had been made." "Oh, that's all right," said the coroner. "I'll get a few of the neighbors together and hold an inquest right away. It will be death at the hands of some person unknown, I suppose. Rather a bold deed, sir?" "Yes," said Nick soberly. "Rather a bold deed." Chapter 4 A Group of Three "Shall you attend the inquest?" asked Chick, as the two detectives moved away in the direction of the orchard. "No," was the reply. "As the coroner said, the verdict will be that Maynard came to his death at the hands of some person or persons unknown. I want the formalities through with as soon as possible." The detectives now found themselves at the foot of the ladder which had been raised to the lean-to roof by the burglars. The footprints were still plainly visible. As has been stated, rain had fallen on the previous night, and the surface of the earth was still damp. The marks of rubber soles were still to be seen in the soft mold between the trees. They led to the north side of the orchard, then across a pasture lot, and onto the highway running parallel with the railroad track. They were lost only when the men approached the station platform. "This looks like a put-up trail," said Chick. "It looks like the work of amateur burglars," said Nick, "who depend upon losing themselves in the city and thus escaping the officers." "I wonder if they carried the diamonds over that route?" asked Chick. "And I was wondering," said Nick, "if they knew what to do with the gems when they got to the city." "How could they have the diamonds?" asked Chick. "They did not get beyond Anton's room, and the diamonds were not there. I guess the members of the Maynard family were too quick for them." "Don't jump at conclusions," warned Nick. "Well, I don't like the looks of things up there," said the assistant, "and I have an idea that they ought to be watched." "Of course," said the chief. "You are to go back there and hang around with Charlie Maynard as soon as we land these fellows on the train, or become convinced that they did not take a train back to the city." "There is a train leaves here at 4:00 in the morning," said Chick, referring to a timetable. "They might have taken that." The fact was that Chick found himself not a little puzzled at the attitude of his chief in the case. Had he been permitted to have his own way, all the investigations would have been confined to the Maynard house. He regarded the burglary as merely incidental, and would not have wasted a moment on it. As he explained to Nick, he did not see how the burglars could have committed the murder or stolen the gems, as they had penetrated into the house no farther than the rear room. He determined that if he was left at the house, in charge of the case there, the inmates would have some pretty hard questions to answer. Nick must have detected his intentions, for he said: "Let the inmates of the house alone. Let them say and do what they please, and go where they see fit, but keep your eyes on them. I want to know whom they see and what they do." "Very well," said Chick, not a little disappointed. "Now," continued the chief, "it may be that Charlie was drugged on the night of the murder and robbery. See what you can learn about that." "You think that probable?" "It is at least possible," was the reply. "Then that shows a desire on the part of someone in the house to rob him. As I said before, I think the burglars were on a worked-out claim." Nick chuckled, but said nothing. Chick had differed with his chief in so many cases which had been won that he was not inclined to force his opinions to the front, so he remained silent. The railroad station at which the detectives now stood was a small affair, and was usually closed in the night time. No through trains stopped there, but at 4:00 in the morning a local passed into the city, and an agent was always there at that time. A short distance from the station was a little suburban store where fruit and light lunches were sold. Many suburbanites took and left the trains there during the day, and the keeper of the store did quite a business. Nick approached him as he stood serving coffee and sandwiches to two travelers. "Were you here this morning?" he asked. "I sleep here," was the reply. Nick called him aside as soon as his customers left. "Were you in your place of business when the train passed here at 4:00 this morning?" he asked. The place was not open, was the reply, but I was awake. Did the train stop? Yes, sir. It always does. There are usually early birds out. We call them 4 o'clockers. Their work in the city begins early? I suppose so. Do you happen to know whether any strangers were about here when the train came in? Yes, sir, I do, was the reply. I usually don't, but this morning a fool couple got under my window there at the back of the house, and whispered and talked and quarreled until I was ready to get up and fight. You could not hear what they were saying? I caught a word only now and then. I was too mad to listen quietly. That was a queer place for a conference under a sleeping room window, suggested the detective. Oh, they probably thought the house unoccupied during the night. It doesn't look much like a residence, now, does it? The man cocked his head to one side and regarded the little structure, built of plain boards nailed on perpendicularly and battened, with a critical eye. But the people who usually come to this station know your habits, don't they? Asked Nick. I should think they ought to, was the reply. I have been here long enough. Then these men must have been strangers? Oh, I have no doubt of that. You say they quarreled? Not until a third man came up. So there was a third man? Didn't I say 3 at first? No, you said 2. Well, there were 2 at first, and then a third man came, and they got into a mix-up over something. Did they fight? Only with their mouths. About what? About putting something in a trunk. Nick saw that the country merchant did not know how to relate what had taken place, with reference to the leading points, so he was obliged to humor him and ask many questions. So they had a trunk? He asked. Didn't I say they had a trunk? You did not. Was the trunk delivered there in a wagon? No. A man, the third man, brought it on his shoulder. Did they open it? Of course. Didn't I say they quarreled about putting something in it? Did they put something in it? Yes, after a lot of talking. What did they say? 2 men said it was safer to carry the package, and the third man said they knew what his orders were. Did you hear any names mentioned? Just one. What was that name? Hartley. Ah. It was with difficulty that Nick concealed his joy. Hartley was the name of a noted diamond dealer in New York, and Hartley was said by the police to furnish money for enterprises of a shady nature. What was said concerning Hartley? Asked Nick in a moment. I only heard his name mentioned once. You heard nothing said regarding the contents of the package they put in the trunk? Asked the detective. I heard one of the men say that they would be fools to give up so much without getting their money down. Ah, so Hartley had already arranged for the diamonds to be delivered to him. The third man was Hartley's agent. Where did this third man come from? Asked Nick. He must have come in from some of the burgs where the morning train does not stop, and carried his trunk with him. Was it a large trunk? No, a small one. What did they finally do with it? They gave it in charge of the baggage man when the train came, after getting it checked by the station agent. Who did? The man who brought it. With the package inside? I suppose so. You saw them hand it over? Yes, the men parted after the train came in, and I did not see the 2 Englishmen again. Oh, they were Englishmen? Yes. Didn't I say so? The man must have bought a ticket to get the trunk checked? Of course. Did the men part in anger? Why, when they all ran off, they did not have time to say goodbye to each other. They were too much in a hurry. You did not say that they got away in a hurry. Oh, didn't I? Well, they did. They found out that someone was listening. That was just after the train came in. So they ducked, and the man who had been listening went to the train. How long was he there? Just a minute. When he came up to where the trunk had been opened, after they left, the girl made her appearance, and they walked away together in the direction of the platform. I did not recognize either of them. You see, it was dark, and they were not close to the window." "Now you've brought a girl in," said Nick. "You must have had quite a matinee under your window this morning." "Didn't I tell you about the girl before?" "Certainly not." "Well, it struck me that she was down here to meet some one who came on the train, and went away on the train." Nick began to look puzzled. This was not so easy. Who was this girl? Could it have been Bernice? Could it have been anyone from the Maynard house? Had the girl and the strange man been sent there to watch the others, and see that the trunk was on the train according to arrangements previously made by Hartley? Nick had a notion who the Englishmen were. They were probably the sailors Charlie had seen the previous afternoon. Chick had suggested that the diamonds had been followed from Cape Town or from Liverpool, and this might prove to be a fact. The part of the third man was plain enough, Nick thought. He was there to receive the diamonds from the thieves. Hartley would take no chances of their being delivered to him in the city. But this fourth man and the girl? That was the puzzler. "How many girls live close about here?" asked Nick. "Girls? Dozens of 'em. What with the daughters of the suburbanites, and their maids and servants, I can't begin to keep track of them." "But none live close to the station." "Oh, they are often about here at the time this early train passes. I don't know where they all come from, I'm sure." "Well," said Nick, "if a man came here on a train, and left on the same one, and met a girl here, it must have been by previous arrangement, of course, and may occur again. You keep your eye out for a couple of weeks when this morning train passes, and you shall be well paid for your work." "All right," was the reply, as the man pocketed a banknote of liberal denomination. "They won't get away from me again." Nick now went to the station agent and asked about the tickets purchased for the early morning train. The agent declared that none had been bought that morning. "But a trunk was checked," insisted the detective. "That was on a ticket bought in the afternoon," said the agent. "Do you know how many people took that morning train from this station?" asked the detective. "I do not." "Did you see people waiting for the train here?" "Say," said the agent, "I don't know what's getting into folks today. It seems that there was something doing when that train went by." "Ah, the sheriff has been here?" "Yes, and a lot from Maynard House." "Who, for one?" "Anton Sawtell, for one. Got quite a clip, didn't he?" "Sure he did," was the reply. "What questions did he ask?" "Just about what you did. He wanted to know who left here on the morning train." "And you could not tell him?" "Certainly not. The conductor may be able to, though." "Did Sawtell give descriptions of people and ask you to verify them?" "He asked for 2 men carrying the odor of rum, and for a black-haired girl." So here was the girl again! And Sawtell knew of her presence at the station. What else did he say about the girl, or about the men? He said that the men talked with a strong London accent. Nothing more about the girl. Anton must have hastened to the station while the detectives were at the house. There was now no such thing as leaving him out of the case. "Who left the train here?" asked Nick, in a moment. "I am certain that no one left the train here." Anton asked about a girl. "Did you notice a girl loitering about here previous to the arrival of the train, or after it left this morning?" "I did not. No girl came in here." "So the girl, if there was one, kept in the background?" "Yes, that's it." Nick left the agent and walked up and down the small platform. "The gems may be at Hartley's by this time," he thought. "The 2 Englishmen who smell of rum and talk like London may be on the ocean by this time, but I imagine I know where the girl is. This case is not so mixed, after all." After a long talk with Chick, the detective took a train for New York, hopeful and enthusiastic over the clues he had already uncoiled. Chick returned to the Maynard home. It was dull there, and for a long time there were no movements among the inmates that seemed worthy of attention. Chapter 5. Cunning Foes. That evening, while Chick sat in comfort on the north porch at the Maynard house, strong in the belief that his chief had gone to New York in quest of a murderer and thief who was then in that house, Nick was standing in front of a small, mean-looking store near Chatham Square. There was a pawnbroker's sign over the door, and diamonds were shown in the windows in goodly quantities. On the door itself, the top half of which was of glass, was the line, "Diamonds bought and sold." Below was the one word, "Hartley." The detective had reached the city at 3:00, and at once "made up" for an inspection of the diamond merchant's place of business. Standing across the street, Nick had the appearance of a sailor having a leave of absence, and a desire to observe all that was worth seeing in the city. Presently Nick went into the store and stood by the front counter, which was covered with showcases, each containing diamonds of all sizes and shades. The salesman who came forward to wait upon him leaned on one of the cases carelessly, and looked only casually at the pretended sailor. "I wants to sell me diamond," said Nick. "Let's see it, mate." Nick took from his pocket a superb stone worth fully $500. It was finely cut and had been removed from its setting. In fact, it was a stone which the detective frequently wore. "How much for it?" he asked. "Where did you get it?" asked the clerk. Nick gave an impatient hitch to his breeches. "This hain't no bloomin' police station, is it?" he asked. "No," was the reply, "but we like to know where the goods we buy come from." Nick put the stone back into his pocket and moved toward the door. "Wait," said the clerk. "How much do you want for it?" "400," was the short reply. "I'll give you $50," said the clerk. Nick went back and began to haggle with the clerk. What he wanted was to keep in the store long enough to size it up thoroughly. Besides, he had a notion that the two men who had been described as smelling of rum and talking like London might pay their respects to the diamond merchant. Now and then during the conversation Nick walked to the front door and looked out into the street. Just across the way, Patsy, next to Chick, his best assistant, stood in a make-up similar to that worn by his chief. Nick had an idea that the two sailors, who were evidently unused to the ways of New York crooks, would loiter about Hartley's place. Patsy was watching in the street for the reason that the men might visit the vicinity of the diamond shop without actually going in. If they came within sight, he was to motion to Nick if it were possible to make him see through the crowd, and if not, he was to go to the store after him. But it was not necessary for Patsy to signal to Nick or to call him from the store. As the chief approached the door, after being in the establishment for some time, he saw two men resembling the ones he sought standing in front of the store. They were talking together earnestly, making quick gestures with their hands. Nick passed out into the street and halted near them. One of the men looked the detective over and approached him, pushing pedestrians aside like a man in the fighting stage of intoxication. "Hello, shipmate," he said, laying a hand heavily on Nick's shoulder. "Doing biz with that bloomin' shark?" "He won't buy," replied Nick. "He wants the bloomin' earth, he does." "He's a shark, a Indian Ocean shark," roared the sailor. "He's got to take a broadside for me the day." "You ain't out on a bloomin' desert island now," said Nick. "You'll get in irons, that's what you'll get, if you lay alongside of that pirate here. Offered me $50 for a $500 diamond. That's what he did, blast him." Patsy came up at this moment, and the four wandered away to a drinking place on the Bowery and sat down at a table. Nick was by no means certain that the men he was with were the ones he sought. They drank rum liberally at Nick's expense, but did not appear to get much the worse for their libations. They cursed Hartley from keel to topmast, as one of them expressed it, but refused to mention the cause of their hatred. "You're from London?" Nick said, after a time. "How is the old town?" Nick knew London like a book, and his reference to the music halls and sailor resorts set the men to talking. "We're going back when we gets brass enough," one of them said. "We've come over 'ere on a bloomin' cruise after the wind on the tops of the tall buildings. That's what we has, mate." One of the men sprang to his feet. I'm going after him," he said. "You're drunk," said the other. "Let him alone." "If you're afraid to go, I goes alone," was the reply. "I'll go with you to see the shark," said Nick. The sailor seized Nick's hand and almost dragged him to the door. "We'll board the bloomin' pirate," he said. The detective began to think that he had made no mistake in figuring on the movements of the two strange men. "This man is drunk," he thought, "but not so drunk as he pretends to be. He has probably nerved himself with liquor for an unpleasant interview. If he is the man I suspect him to be, the fact is likely to come out in the talk between the merchant and himself. If he is not one of the sailors who appeared at the Maynard house yesterday, I shall soon know that." The detective was now in a section of New York where the life of a man known to be in quest of lawbreakers is hardly safe. The lawless ones of the great city often make that section their home when pursued by officers of the law, and will defend each other to the death. The establishment of the diamond merchant was ostensibly respectable, but there were, in police records, accounts of men and women who had entered the half-glazed door possessed of valuable gems and had never returned to their former haunts. Nick knew that the outlaws of New York boasted that there were hidden cellars and secret rooms and stairways in the buildings of that quarter which no officer had ever been able to discover. The sailor entered the store and advanced toward the rear, which was dimly lighted by a yellow jet of gas, the daylight which came through the dusty glass in front not penetrating into the back of the long room. There, on a high stool at a standing desk, bent over the pages of a great book of accounts, was a man with iron gray hair and stooping shoulders. He glanced up as the two men approached, and Nick made a mental note of the keenest black eyes he had ever seen under a mass of gray hair. The sailor stepped up to the desk and laid his arm insolently on a pile of books at the merchant's elbow. Then he steadied himself and glared at the figure before him. "You are here again, are you?" asked the merchant impatiently. "I told you to keep away from here." "You know what I come for," said the sailor sullenly. "Who is that with you?" demanded the diamond merchant suspiciously. "A maid I picked up out here." "If your maid has influence with you," said the merchant, "I advise him to use it in getting you aboard a ship as soon as possible." "Hartley is playing a bold game," thought Nick. "Hand out our coin, then," said the sailor, "and we'll go soon enough." "We have had enough of this," said Hartley. "You must cease to persecute me or take the consequences. However, this is no matter to discuss before a third party. Come with me, and you, matey, remain where you are." Hartley moved toward a rear door, accompanied by the sailor, and Nick stepped back to a chair which stood at the end of the counter, hidden from the front by a stack of boxes and books. The clerk in front walked back and saw that the detective was in the chair, and returned to the front, seemingly to watch through the door for customers. The thing for Nick to do now was to listen to the conversation which was to take place between the men who had just left him. But how? There were two doors opening from the room to the rear. One was at about the middle of the store, and the other was close to the wall at the left and about opposite the chair in which Nick sat. Hartley and the sailor had passed through the center door, so this probably led to another room. The other door, being near the wall, undoubtedly led to a hallway running to the rear of the building. Nick resolved to investigate. Seeing that his weapons were handy, he moved toward the side door, being careful to keep below the top of the long desk. The clerk was apparently busy in front, and did not hear the door open, as Nick supposed, and so the detective stepped into a dark passage and prepared to bring his flash into use. Then, before he could take the lantern from his pocket, he heard a sharp click, like the movement of a metallic spring, and dropped into the darkness. The floor had fallen away beneath his feet, and he was sliding down a well of a place which seemed scores of feet deep and just large enough in diameter to permit the passage of his body. It was the old trick of lower New York, which had been worked thousands of times and will be worked as many times more. Nick, who had been up against a trapdoor game before, would naturally have been more careful in that treacherous establishment, only for the fact that he believed his disguise perfect, and Hartley rather above the murder of inquisitive men, whom he had had no occasion to suspect of greater interference with his plans than the opening of a door for the purpose of listening to a forbidden conversation. As Nick dropped into the dark tunnel, he heard a trapdoor close above his head, and at the same instant his right heel caught in what seemed to be little more than a horizontal crevice in the wall of the place. At the moment of falling, he had crowded his feet out to the sides and his hands to the front, in hope of finding some break to check his fall. Finding that his heel was slipping from the place where it rested, Nick drew out his knife, which opened as he removed it from his pocket, the blade being controlled by a spring at the back, and drove it into the wall to his left. Supported by this and by the foothold on the right, the detective began an investigation of the place. He could have used his lantern readily enough, as the right hand was free, but he was afraid of watching eyes, so he groped about in the darkness, hoping to find an outlet about where his heel had struck. He understood the trap games of New York well enough to know that the shaft communicated with more than one basement of the building, which was an old one and probably full of devices for the destruction of unwelcome guests. If he could come upon a door connecting with the floor directly underneath the store, the trick of the diamond merchant might, after all, be turned to good advantage. A careful examination of the wall on the right convinced the detective that the door to the first basement was where his foot had struck, that, in fact, his heel rested on a bit of flooring under the crack of the door. Now, he thought, I wonder which way this door opens. If they throw people down here, it opens into the room. If they back people up against the wall and let them fall in, it opens into the shaft. Ah, here it is. The door gave way under the pressure of Nick's foot, and a faint light crept into the shaft. There was a light at the front of the first basement, and men were there engaged in unpacking boxes. It was no easy matter for Nick to change his position so as to pass through the doorway, but he succeeded at last, and stood in the shadows cast by the flaring gas jet in front. He knew that those at work could not see him, so he moved about with considerable confidence. The basement was used for storing and packing and unpacking goods of many kinds. At the back, where Nick stood, it was well nigh filled with boxes of various sizes. At the right of the basement, facing from the front, was a stairway running to the store floor above. This, the detective thought, might lead to the rear room where the talk between the diamond merchant and the sailor was in progress. He mounted the steps halfway and paused, listening for the sound of voices. As he waited, he thought with wonder at the position in which he found himself. That a New York merchant, of the apparent respectability of Hartley, should occupy a place of business set with a man-trap of the character which had caught him was incredible enough, but that he should actually bring it into use was almost beyond belief. It meant much to the detective. It showed him that the establishment was one in which such devices were considered necessary to the business of the proprietor, and therefore one which should be broken up by the police. It was almost incredible that such a den should exist within a few blocks of Broadway. Presently the sound of voices came to the ears of the listening detective. First he heard the smooth tones of the merchant saying, "You have betrayed me, and you cannot deceive me again. The best thing you can do is to leave the country, and leave it at once." "How can we go off without the coin? Tell me that," answered the voice of the sailor. "I'll split on the game if we don't get our own." "What have you done with the diamonds?" demanded the merchant. Nick bent forward eagerly. At last his quest was to be crowned with results. What diamonds could be meant save the ones stolen from the Maynard home? "I give them to the bloomin' toff you sent up there," was the angry reply. "That is not true," said the merchant. "You gave him a counterfeit package, and stood by while he packed it in the trunk and checked the trunk. From the moment the trunk was closed in your presence, it was never opened again until it was brought here. You stole the diamonds, and now you try to blackmail me." "This is something like," thought Nick. The diamonds were placed in the trunk, as I supposed, and shipped here. Hartley says he never received them. Sailor says he delivered them to the agent. Now, which one lies, and where are the diamonds?" "It's a lie!" shouted the sailor. "Your bloomin' pirate got the gems." "You talk of splitting on the game," continued the merchant. "What do you know of the murder which took place at the Maynard house on the night of your visit there?" "That's Gaff." "Gaff, is it?" demanded Hartley. "Read the newspapers when you go out and see if I speak the truth. Maynard was murdered in his bed on the night you secured the diamonds. You'll both find yourselves in the electric chair if you say too much about the affair." "Slout me!" cried the sailor. "I don't know of any murder. The merchant interrupted him. "I don't want to know anything about it," he said. "I merely repeat my former advice, which is to get out of the country." Nick waited in vain for the sailor to go on. What words were on his tongue when so suddenly checked? He made general denial. Who, then, had murdered Alvin Maynard? Where were the diamonds? Nick was listening to the voice of one of the men who had stolen the gems, yet he was no nearer a solution of the murder mystery than before. He believed what the man said regarding the murder. He had not even known of it until informed by the merchant. Even now he seemed to doubt the truth of the statement. "I'll land him in the Tombs when he leaves here," thought Nick, "and we'll see about the murder later. It is possible that, after all, he knows where the diamonds are. And yet, men of his character don't usually hang about for a little money when in the possession of $500,000 in diamonds." But Nick's plans were defeated by something which happened on the floor above. He heard a quick blow, a fall, and then the groans of a man in agony. As he was about to spring up the stairs, and through the door at the top, the sound of another voice came to his ears. How was that for a knockout? It was the coarse voice of a bully. "Very well done," replied the merchant. "Put him in the shaft with his mate." "Croak him?" asked the other. "No, fix him up so that he won't know his own name when he is able to be about again," was the reply. Chapter 6. Death Comes Too Soon. So that he won't know his own name when he is able to be about again. Nick knew very well what that meant. The sailor was to be beaten and imprisoned and drugged and frightened until he became crazed, and then turn out into the world again. Even if some faint glimmerings of what had taken place should come to him, no one would credit the statement of a half-crazed sailor, who, as would be believed, came by his infirmity on the high seas and had forgotten. "It is devilish," muttered the detective. "I wonder how I'm going to get at the fellow before they quite kill his intelligence?" Locked in the unconscious brain of the sailor was the story of the taking of the diamonds, if not the story of the murder of Alvin Maynard. If he could only communicate with Patsy, sitting there in the saloon with the other party to the robbery! If Patsy only knew, then the whole thing would be easy. The fact that the diamond merchant had been implicated in the robbery could not aid the detective at that time. He had no proof except the words of the sailor he had heard while listening on the stairs. But all in good time the necessary evidence would be found. He was certain of that. Nick might now do one of two things. One was to remain in the basement and get to the sailor after he had been dumped down the shaft. Wounded and in fear of death, the man would be likely to tell all he knew about the diamond robbery. The other was to force his way out of the basement and take the sailor with Patsy into custody. This man probably knew as much of the affair as the other. After studying the matter over, Nick decided to remain and assist the sailor out of the den he was in. The other man might prove sullen and refuse to talk after being placed under arrest. Besides, humanity prompted the detective to help the wounded sailor. Only that such a course would have placed Hartley on his guard and defeated all his plans. Nick would have beaten down the door and rushed to the rescue of the sailor then and there. In fact, this was his first idea, but he quickly saw that to do so would be to imperil the success of the case. But it was not entirely in the hope of recovering the diamonds that the detective decided to remain where he was. There might be peril in remaining, but there were things to be cleared up of more importance than the recovery of the diamonds. The sailor might be able to throw some light on the strange murder of Alvin Maynard. At least he would be able to tell how the diamonds had been secured, and to explain the situation in the house at the time of his visit. He was positive that the robbers had not passed beyond Anton's room, and he wanted an account of what had taken place there. There were many things to be explained, and the sailors were the only ones who would be apt to tell the truth. Presently, a noise like that made by dragging a heavy body over the floor came from the private room just over Nick's head. The paid assassin of the diamond merchant was about to complete his task. Just at this moment, the workmen employed at the front of the basement extinguished their light and went away. Their departure gave Nick an opportunity to work out a plan, which had been forming in his brain. The sailor was undoubtedly badly wounded now, and would, of course, be still further hurt by a long drop into the sub-basement. Nick wanted to get at the man while he was in good shape, while he could talk of the events of the previous night. A long board lay on one of the packing boxes, and the detective took this and carried it to the shaft. "I'll switch the victim off their trunk line to death or insanity," thought Nick, "if my usual luck will hold for a few minutes." The board was wide as well as long, and perfectly smooth on one side. Bracing one end against the wall of the shaft opposite the door, the detective placed the other against a heavy box, which he dragged up to the dark doorway. "Now, my cunning friends," he mused, "your sailor will strike this slanting board when you dump him into the shaft, and be shunted into this basement. I hope they will dump him in without throwing a flash of light into the shaft. That might spoil everything, as it would disclose the presence of the board, and might make it necessary for me to do a little shooting." Satisfied as to the utility of his plan, the detective stood in the open doorway and waited. Before long he heard a sound at the trapdoor above, and a gleam of light appeared. Nick almost held his breath. If they should take a notion to look down the shaft, his plans would be ruined. But they did not. It was a gruesome place at best, and the associations were probably far from pleasant. So they just lifted the trap in the floor above and threw the sailor down. Nick knew by the movements above, plainly heard as being directly over his head, that the man had been taken from the rear room to the hall and there disposed of. It was pitch dark in the basement, so those above could not see that the door was open. In a second the unconscious man came tumbling down, and Nick stood ready to direct the fall into the basement where he stood. The man struck the plank, which gave a trifle under the weight, and slid swiftly toward the door. There was not room on either side of the plank to fall off. "This is great business for the heart of New York City," thought Nick, as he caught the sailor in his arms. "Now, I wonder how badly this man is injured." He flashed a gleam from his flash on the man's face, which was covered with blood, and saw that his eyes were opening. Then the man raised his head and tried to speak. The detective lifted him higher and bent his ear to catch the sound. "There was no killin'," the man muttered. "But the man up there is dead," whispered Nick in the man's ear. "Who did the killing?" "We did not," was the faint reply. "Where did you get the diamonds?" asked Nick, seeing that the man had been fatally wounded by the savage blow of the bully, and could not last much longer. "We watched, and got them from—" That was all. It was only a dead man that lay in the detective's arms. The sailor had died with his secret on his lips, when one more word would have set everything straight. There was now but one thing for the detective to do, and that was to reach Patsy and the other sailor, and take the latter into custody. He was guilty only of robbery, and might be induced to tell the truth by promises of leniency. Besides, he would doubtless be greatly enraged at the murder of his companion, and this might cause him to relate not only the events of the night at the Maynard house, but also the deal with Hartley. For the murder of the sailor, Hartley and the bully could be called to account later. Nick ascended the stairs to the rear room, listened at the door, opened it a trifle, and looked inside. There was no one there, and the only light came through a transom over the door leading to the store. Crossing the room softly, Nick came to a door opening into the hall. It was through this doorway that the sailor had been carried on the way to the shaft. Nick lifted the trap and looked down. All was dark and still below, and a swirl of foul air came up into his face. His flash showed the board to be in position. I came near making a blunder there, he mused. If they see that, they will know that their secret is known, and flee. I must go back. The detective hastened to the basement, returned the board to the place from which it had been taken, and arranged the body so as to give the impression that it had fallen through the doorway instead of proceeding down the shaft. Then he opened a door leading to the sub-basement, left the door to the store floor open, and passed on to the hall again. They will never suspect that the sailor did not fall into the first basement, he thought, and they may believe that I found my way out of the place where they dumped me, or thought they dumped me. However, we must get the bully under lock and key as soon as possible. It is the electric chair for him. Hartley must be watched until we know more about the diamond deal. At the rear of the hall in which Nick now found himself, a staircase led to the second floor. As Nick started to ascend it in the darkness, a man came rushing down and almost fell over him. Nick quickly stepped aside, and the fellow, who was panting as from a long run or struggle, passed on to the door of the rear room and entered. While Nick waited, wondering if it was now safe to attempt the ascent of the stairs, there was a rush of feet in the store in front, and angry voices came to the ears of the listener. "I tell you he came in here," Nick heard a voice say. "You've hidden him somewhere." Some street row, thought Nick. All was still on the second floor when Nick reached the head of the stairs, and in a moment he was in the street. About the first person he saw there was Patsy. There was an excited crowd in front of the store, and policemen were guarding the door. "What is it?" asked Nick. "They did up my sailor," was the reply. "Where is your man?" "Dead," was the reply. "And yours?" "Gone to the hospital with a smash on the head that would have killed an ox," was the reply. "I don't think he'll ever get over it." "How did it happen?" asked Nick. "Well, we got tired of waiting for you, and came and stood in front of the shop, here. Presently a tough mug of a fellow came out and looked us over. Then he went back and whispered with the clerk, and a gray-haired man was called into the conversation. We could see them through the window, and noted that they were all very much excited." Nick began to understand. "Then the tough mug came out and began picking a quarrel with us. The sailor was drunk and made a dash at him. He got a thump on the head that will hold him for a long time, I reckon, and then the tough came at me. I gave him one in the eye, and he turned and ran away. I think he went up the stairway, but the mom says he went into the store." "He is probably cursing the clerk good and plenty by this time," said Nick. "I figure it out that the clerk thought he dumped the other sailor's partner when he dumped me, and so imagined that both were provided for. Then, when the bully saw the other one on the street with you, he understood that something must be done, for he knew too much about the diamond deal, and would be making inquiries for his partner, who had entered this place not long before." "And his partner is dead?" asked Patsy. "Dead down there in the cellar," said Nick. "And the bully thought that both parties to the diamond deal were down there, all safe and beyond the power of harm?" "That is about it." "Well," said Patsy, "if one is dead, the rascals are safe for a time, all right, for the other will not be out of the hospital for a long time, and may not know his own name when he does come out. He got a fierce smash on the front of the head." "It was evidently the purpose to craze the man," said Nick. "That seems to be a cheerful way these fellows have. Well, this leaves us in bad shape. I know now that the two sailors took the diamonds from the Maynard house, but I don't know where the diamonds are, any more than I did an hour ago. Again, these men might have thrown some light on the murder of Alvin Maynard. That is now impossible, for one is dead, and the other may never regain his senses." "This man Hartley seems to be playing a close game," said Patsy. "Dumped you, did they?" Nick explained very briefly what had taken place in Hartley's establishment. "So the diamonds are actually lost?" asked Patsy. "It seems so," was the reply. "The sailors got them, in what manner I hope soon to learn, and turned them over to the agent. The agent put them in his trunk in their presence and checked them to New York. When the trunk got to Hartley's the diamonds were gone, and a counterfeit package lay in the trunk. And it seems that both the sailor and the agent went to Hartley for their pay, which they would not have done if they had played him false. It is a great mix-up, and the finding of the men who took the diamonds from the house seems to have little bearing on the finding of the man who killed Alvin Maynard." "There must be some common sense solution," said Patsy. "I have thought," said Nick, "that the sailors took from the house a package supposed to contain the diamonds, but I can't imagine them traveling to the station and turning over what they had to the agent without knowing whether they had the gems or not. They would not trust to appearances. Such men never do." "Chick may learn something up at the Maynard house," suggested Patsy. "In the meantime," said Nick, "we ought to get our hand on that bully and lock him up. But this should be done without letting Hartley know that he has been arrested. Now, I am going up to the Maynard house tonight, and I want you to manage the arrest of the bully. String a line of men around the whole block, if necessary, but get him. I'll be back in the morning. And, when you arrest the fellow, don't let him communicate with any one. Hartley would make a jump for liberty that might give us a long chase." It was 8:00 when the detective left a train at the little suburban railroad station. Chick stood on the platform waiting for him. "What's the news?" asked the chief. "Unless I am much mistaken," was the reply, "the diamonds are still about the house. If they are not, there are a lot of lunatics up there." "For instance?" "Well, Mrs. Maynard seems to have recovered from her fits. At any rate, she sits in the parlor and watches Anton every minute of the time. If he goes to his room, she makes an errand upstairs. If he goes out into the grounds, she is not far away." "Go on," said Nick. "And Anton seems to be keeping his eye on the maid, Bernice. He goes where she is as often as he decently can, and once I heard them quarreling in the shrubbery." "Then you think Mrs. Maynard suspects Anton?" "I don't know if she suspects him of the robbery and the murder, but I believe she thinks he knows all about the events of that night. You know she was about the house herself, and took the diamonds from the trunk." "That is the way we figured it out this morning," said Nick, thinking of the girl Anton had inquired for at the depot. "I guess that is settled," said Chick. "Nothing is settled until the case is ended," replied Nick. "For instance, you speak of the diamonds being here in the house at this moment. What if I tell you that I heard a man admit taking them and turning them over to one of Hartley's agents?" "Is that a fact?" asked Chick, in surprise. Nick then related, in brief, the story of the afternoon's work. "Here is the mystery," said Chick. "How did the men get the diamonds? They did not penetrate the house farther than the west room. Who gave them the gems, then? And who killed Alvin Maynard? Again, the burglars were not in a position to do it. They never got to that front room. Were there two sets of criminals in the house last night, each acting with a different purpose in view?" Nick smiled, but attempted no explanation. He had his own notion about things, but he was not ready to tell the story of the crime, even to his assistant. The detectives were now walking side by side under the orchard trees, perhaps 50 yards back of the house. They had followed the track taken in the morning. It was a moonlight night, but there were heavy banks of clouds in the sky, and now and then the landscape was in darkness. "Here we are at the path leading to the house," said Nick, "and we may as well find out what Charlie Maynard is thinking of. How does he take the loss of his diamonds now that the excitement has worn off?" "Like the sensible fellow that he is," was the reply. "And it has been discovered that he is not broke if he never gets the diamonds. He was Alvin's favorite, and the old man was rich. Charlie gets a couple of millions." "Then he can well afford to take the matter coolly," said Nick, "for " But the sentence was never finished. 2 revolver shots came from a thicket in the orchard. Then, in the moonlight, 2 spiral puffs of smoke crept upward. It was a close call, but the bullets did no harm. Chapter 7 at 4 o'clock. "That was going some," said Chick coolly. Nick did not wait to make reply. He rushed the thicket whence the shots had come, but arrived too late to find the would-be murderer there. When Chick reached the spot, he found his chief down on his knees, examining the earth, lantern in hand. As the assistant came up, Nick shut off the flash and moved away from the spot. "Now," said Chick, "that shows that there are people about here who are implicated in the happenings of last night. They evidently think we are getting too inquisitive." Nick walked on toward the house without making reply. He was thinking fast. Once more his clues were pointing in a contrary direction. Those shots were intended to defend the murderer and not the diamond thief, he mused. Now, I wonder if the people up here have fallen into my trap. Arrived at the house, Nick and Chick, after a moment's conversation with Mrs. Maynard and Charlie, proceeded to the second floor of the mansion. Nick stopped at the head of the stairs, with a smile on his face. The stairs and the halls had been swept and washed during the day, thus removing every trace of the record left by naked feet the night before. Nick hastened to the closet in Anton's room. When he came out again, the smile on his face had broadened. His next move was to visit the hallway used by the servants in reaching the rooms over the main part of the house. This, too, had been cleaned, and tiny marks which Nick had observed on the door in the morning had been obliterated. In one place the paint had been partially rubbed from the door casing in scrubbing off a stain. The detective turned toward the lower part of the house. "The case up here is closed," he said. Chick opened his eyes, but said nothing. Nick went to the back end of the house and asked for Bernice. "She's gone," said one of the servants. "Gone where?" "To the city," was the reply. Nick smiled and turned away. He remembered distinctly of having caught a glimpse of the girl at one of the upper windows just before entering the orchard, perhaps 5 minutes before the shooting. "She went away 2 hours ago," said the servant, a young girl who seemed devoted to the maid. "I saw her take the train." Nick thought he knew why the girl had been hiding in the house, and why she had instructed the servant to tell of her departure. He turned to his assistant. "Bernice may try to take the next train," he said. "Now, I want to talk with her before she gets off, and I wish you would watch the depot and see that she remains here at least until morning." "But she has already gone," said Chick. "You may find her hiding about the station," said Nick. "The girl is frightened half to death. Anton thinks she has the diamonds." "I don't understand," said Chick. But Nick would talk no more, so the assistant set out to the depot. Nick then asked for Mrs. Maynard, and together they ascended to the maid's room. The old lady was trembling violently, and it was with difficulty that Nick got her into the room. The results of the interview were far-reaching. "Where is Bernice?" asked the old lady at the close of the talk. "She is waiting to get to New York," was the reply. "Yes, she asked permission to go, sometime in the afternoon," said the old lady, "and it was granted. The poor girl is half crazed." Nick smiled and escorted Mrs. Maynard back to the parlor. "The case is clearing," he thought. "If I only had a line on the whereabouts of the diamonds!" At that moment Charlie Maynard entered the parlor, which Nick was about to leave. "There are strange things about here," he said. "Who did the shooting?" "All in good time," said Nick. "There is little use in discussing suspicions." "Do you think the diamonds are still in this house?" asked the young man. "I know that they are not," was the reply. In a few words, Nick explained the events of the afternoon in the city. Charlie gave an exclamation of vexation. "If the sailor stole the diamonds," he said, "and gave them to the agent, and someone unknown and untraceable stole them from the agent, what chance do I have of ever getting them back? If the sailors, who were in the house for a felonious purpose, did not murder my uncle, who did? I think we are further from the end of the case than when we began." "If I have my usual luck," replied Nick, "you shall hear the end of the case before another sunrise." "Then you must know exactly what you are doing," said Charlie. "I am sure that no one else does." "Right you are," replied Nick. "There is one chance in 2 that I have located the diamonds. Be patient until the time for the disclosure comes." Charlie went grumbling off to his room, and Nick sat on the porch or wandered about in the moonlight until 3:00. Then he went toward the station, taking a roundabout path. He had heard nothing from Chick since he had left the house early in the evening. The detective did not go straight to the station, but stopped in a thicket of evergreens that bordered a fence not far from the little railroad house. From his hiding place he had a full view of the back of the building, and also of the window of the little store under which so many things had taken place the night before. As Nick lay down to await the arrival of the train, Chick crept up and laid a hand on his arm. "I saw you coming," he said. "What's new up at the house?" "The end of the case lies here," said Nick. "We have done with the house end of the murder and the robbery." "Well, you've got me guessing," said Chick. "Did the maid show up?" asked Nick. "She's hanging about in the shrubbery somewhere. Why should she do that?" "She's afraid she'll be arrested for doing the shooting, and for other things," said Nick. "She do the shooting?" said Chick. "Impossible!" "Don't form conclusions yet," said Nick. "It appears to me that you are doing that very well," said Chick. "The girl hasn't seen you, has she?" asked Nick. "I think not. I have not been out in the open, and she has usually been between me and the station. She's shy of being seen, I can tell you that." "Now," said Nick, "the train is coming. Move down to the front, keeping out of sight, and get where you can see the whole length of the line of cars. If a man gets off, you follow him, but keep out of sight. If I point to any person who gets on the train, jump aboard and arrest him before the arrival at New York." "If the girl joins him?" asked Chick. "I presume that is what all this means." "The girl will not join him," was the reply. "She may try to, but she will not succeed." "Who is this man?" asked Chick. Nick laughed. "To be honest with you," he said, "I don't know that there is any man. The girl may be waiting here to sneak away on the train, though it seems strange that she would wait until this hour, when early trains stop here. A girl met a man here last night, and she may meet him again tonight. It looks to me as if that girl was Bernice. We shall soon know if I have doped the case wrong. Here comes the train." Chick glided through the shrubbery, and came out at the front of the locomotive, keeping under the headlight. By moving about a little he could see along both sides of the line of cars. Presently he saw a man step off the smoking car platform on the side opposite the station. He dodged the lighted windows and ducked away to the right, where a patch of bushes hid a view of the field beyond. Chick was not far behind him. He was wondering if Nick was prepared for this, but in a moment he understood. Bernice came out of the copse to meet the man, and a rustle of bushes off to the right told Chick that his chief was there, observing the interview. Chick could not get near enough to hear what was being said, but it looked to him as if Nick was better placed. As the starting bell rang, Chick saw the man take something from his purse and pass it over to Bernice. Then the man moved toward the train, with the girl facing in the same direction. Chick then saw his chief rise up out of the bushes and point to the man, who was making for the train. As the fellow sprang upon the lighted platform, Chick mounted the steps of the now moving train and took a seat in the smoker. He was bound to obey orders, though he knew little of the significance of his own actions. As the train moved off, Bernice skirted the station building and started off toward the house at a swift walk. Nick, who had heard considerable of the girl's talk with the man, followed close behind her. Arriving on the house grounds, she passed around to the kitchen door, which was opened at her knock. Someone had evidently been waiting for her. Nick moved up to a window and looked in. The servant girl he had before talked with stood in front of the maid, a lighted lamp in her hand. The maid's handbag lay on a table between them. As Nick waited, the girls moved into the pantry, as if to get a luncheon, and Nick hastened back to the door, which he found unfastened. The lamp was still in the pantry when the detective opened the outer door and looked into the kitchen. He crept in, seized the handbag, and hastened out again. Stationing himself at the window again, Nick saw the girls leave the pantry. "I thought I heard a noise out here," said Bernice. "It was the wind," said the girl, offering the usual threadbare explanation. Bernice approached the table. "Where is my handbag?" she asked. "I haven't got it," was the reply. "You saw me lay it here?" "Yes." "Someone has stolen it," said the maid, terror showing in her face. Have you seen Anton about here tonight?" "He has not been here," was the reply. "Do you think he would steal it?" "I am sure of it," replied the maid. "Oh, what shall I do? It means ruin to lose that handbag now." "You can buy another," said the girl, stupidly. "But the contents!" cried the maid. "I can't replace them." "Shall I go to Anton's room and see if he is there?" asked the girl. "Yes. No! Oh, what shall I do? Perhaps I had better go myself." Bernice moved away, followed by the servant, and Nick opened the kitchen door again, and entered. He followed the girls through the dining room into a hall from which ran the stairs connecting with the servants' hall on the second floor. Bernice mounted the stairs and soon stood at the door which opened into the main hall, which ran in front of the room where the murder had been committed. "I can't bear to go in there," Nick heard her whisper. "The body is not there," said the servant. "It is in the large room back of the library, and the watchers are there with it." Bernice opened the door and started in. Then she shrank back and said to the girl: "You go, Nancy, and see if there is a light in Anton's room." The girl returned presently and said that there was a light there. "Then you remain here," said Bernice, "and I'll go and see him. Don't you stir until I return. Oh, what shall I do?" Nick heard the girl sobbing convulsively for a moment after she was left alone. He waited no longer. He advanced to where the girl stood, lamp in hand, and said: "Go and awake your mistress, and ask her to come to the parlor." "But I was told to remain here," said the loyal servant. "Bernice will be down in a moment," said Nick. As he spoke, the door of Anton's room opened, and the young man and the maid looked out. "What's wanted?" asked Anton. "You are wanted in the parlor, both of you," replied Nick. "Go on, little girl, and tell your mistress to come." "What does this mean?" asked Bernice. "Come to the parlor and find out," replied Nick, stepping to the door of the room occupied by Charlie and knocking on the panels. "Wake up, Charlie," he cried, "and come to the parlor. Your diamonds have been found. Oh, you are dressed," added Nick, opening the door. "I thought you went to bed to get some sleep." "Sleep?" cried the young man. "I have been watching that door all night." He pointed to Anton's door. "You have?" cried Anton. "Why should you watch my door?" "Never mind that," said Nick. "The truth is out, and the story will be told in the parlor. You watched the wrong door, Charlie." A few moments later, an interesting group assembled in the great parlor of the Maynard country house. Mrs. Maynard, Bernice, the small servant girl, Charlie Maynard, and Anton, with a detective, constituted the party. Bernice was deadly pale. Her eyes glared strangely about the room, and her hands trembled violently. Anton took a chair at her side, and seemed anxious to restore her self-command. Mrs. Maynard looked with averted eyes at the couple. Charlie was cool, as usual, but his eyes were fixed reprovingly on the maid. "You stated that the diamonds had been found," he said, turning to Nick. "I have suspected all along that they never left the house." "Is that the reason why you watched Anton's door tonight?" asked Nick. "It is," was the reply. Anton sprang excitedly to his feet. "Remain quiet," said Nick. "There is no need of temper here." "The coward!" cried Anton. "To insult me here in the presence of my mother!" "You were wrong in supposing that the diamonds were in the house," said Nick to Charlie. "They were removed by 2 burglars last night, and are now in New York." "Have the burglars been caught?" asked Anton eagerly. "They have," was the reply. "And have confessed?" asked Charlie. Anton sank back in his chair. "I don't believe it," declared Bernice. "Where are the diamonds located?" asked Charlie. Nick opened his pocketbook and took out a key to which was attached a brass tag. "You stole my handbag!" shouted Bernice. Nick looked up with a smile on his face. "One thing at a time," he said. "Your diamonds, Charlie, are now located in deposit vaults on Broadway, in box number 3879, and this is the key thereof." Bernice looked like a girl about to commit murder. "You thief!" she cried. "You stole my handbag!" Yes, replied Nick. I did steal your handbag. It is down in the kitchen behind the range. I have no further use for it. Did you get this key from her handbag? Demanded Charlie. Nick nodded. Then she stole the diamonds, said Charlie. You are wrong, said the detective. She did not steal the diamonds, but she was prepared to do so, and she concealed all knowledge of their whereabouts, for she knew this morning where they were. It is false, shouted Bernice. Do you get us all up in the night to tell us these things? It is all a lie. You will be claiming, presently, said Anton, that I murdered Alvin Maynard. You did, said Nick coolly. Again Anton sprang to his feet, but Nick lifted the muzzle of a revolver to his breast, and he sat down again. Mrs. Maynard bowed her head and sobbed audibly. Charlie moved nearer to the accused man. Bernice stared like one under a spell, first at Mrs. Maynard and then at Anton, who sat with his eyes fixed reproachfully on his mother. Nick understood the meaning of that look and said, Don't blame your mother. I knew the truth before she confessed to the scene in the dead man's room last night. You are a devil, cried Bernice. If I had only shot straight. It would have been better for you if you had not shot at all, said Nick, for that was what made me certain of your complicity in the diamond robbery. You lie! You lie! I know nothing about it, shouted the girl. Wait, said Nick coolly, and I will tell the story of the robbery and the murder. Chapter 8. How it was done. When the news that the diamonds were coming reached the house, began Nick, Anton, being without money and in debt, began figuring how the inheritance of his cousin by marriage could best be put to his own advantage. That is a lie, roared Anton. If you interrupt me again, said Nick, I'll put the handcuffs on you. You, Anton, even went so far in your envious plotting as to speak to your mother about the diamonds being divided. Charlie, you said, would not miss a few, and it would be the means of saving you from disgrace. Your mother resented the imputation on her honesty, and resolved to see that the diamonds, when they arrived, should be protected from thievery. The diamonds came, and your plans were not perfected. You wanted to keep your skirts clean, yet you wanted to profit by the inheritance of your friend. On the night the diamonds arrived, you remained downstairs long after the others were in their rooms, all except Bernice. You did not tell me the truth when you said that you were almost the first one on the second floor that night. Nick then turned to the company in general as he continued. Seeing that whatever was done must be done at once, Anton that night confided his plans to Bernice, proposing that he get the diamonds and that she dispose of them in a way yet to be arranged. Bernice consented, and Anton went to his room to watch for a chance to steal the diamonds. In the meantime, Charlie had been given a sleeping potion in his lemonade. This was done by Anton doctoring up his own and deftly changing glasses. The substitution was witnessed by Mrs. Maynard, who then began to fear not only for the safety of the gems, but also for the future of her son. Anton went to his room late, after arranging the details of the robbery with Bernice, and sat by his door in undress, waiting for the house to become quiet. While he sat there, he heard his mother leave her room and cross the hall to the apartment where the diamonds were, and where the owner was sound asleep, with the gems unprotected in an old trunk, which was not even locked. Alarmed at the thought of what might take place, Mrs. Maynard had decided to herself take charge of the diamonds for the night. Too loyal to her son to betray him, and thus put Charlie on his guard, she resolved to risk her own reputation for honesty in defending the property. After a time, Mrs. Maynard recrossed the hall to her own room, leaving her son in a frame of mind little short of desperation. All his plans had failed! Then it was that he heard the door of his stepfather's room open. The old man, feeling that something unusual was going on, had watched the hall and had heard his wife enter and leave Charlie's room. That day, the mother had pleaded with her husband in the interest of her spendthrift son and had been refused the money favor she asked. It was natural, then, that the old man should believe that his wife had become a midnight thief in order to provide her son with money. After Mrs. Maynard returned to her room, Mr. Maynard went there, light in hand, and in no gentle frame of mind. He found the diamonds where his wife had placed them, in a little drawer of her dresser, accused her of stealing them, refused to listen to any explanation, and carried the gems off to his own room. "You are an evil spirit!" gasped Bernice. "You have eyes in this house when you are away in New York." "Mrs. Maynard followed her husband on his return to his room," continued Nick. "There she resented his charges, explained her purpose in taking the diamonds, and demanded their return to her custody. But she had asked for money for her son that day, and Mr. Maynard would not listen to her story. He believed that she had stolen the gems for the purpose of enriching her son at the expense of the nephew. After a time the woman tried to take the diamonds by force, and a struggle took place, during which she was thrown to the floor, her head striking on the corner of the lounge, inflicting the wound which she afterward ascribed to a blow from the burglar. Anton, who was watching and listening in the hall, heard the fall and entered the room just in time to see Mr. Maynard bending over his mother in a threatening attitude. Just before leaving his room he had used a geologist's hammer in fixing a box in which he proposed to hide and ship the diamonds. Unconsciously he carried this hammer in his hand when he entered the front room. Seeing his mother insensible on the floor, and Mr. Maynard bending over her in an angry attitude, the young man had every right to believe that he was acting for the best when he bounded forward and struck the man a violent blow on the head. Mr. Maynard fell dead. Alarmed at what he had done, the young man hastened to place the body on the bed and apply restoratives, but it was too late. He then revived his mother and carried her back to her room. While all these events had been going on, Bernice had been waiting at the end of the hall leading to the servants' quarters. She was expecting that Anton would eventually bring her the box containing the diamonds. When Mr. Maynard fell dead, Anton took the diamonds to his room, after a distressing interview with his mother, who was inconsolable at the death of her husband, whose last words to her had been words of anger and reproach. The mother protested without avail against the larceny of the gems. Anton was determined to profit by the events of the night. Anton carried the diamonds to his room and secreted them in a box in the closet. The geologist's hammer with which the murder had been committed was placed on a shelf in the same closet, after being cleared from the marks of the blow, by wiping it on a towel which hung in the closet. This hammer has a break on one side of the striking surface, and this shows in the wound on the dead man. "Is all this necessary?" asked the mother, greatly distressed at the details of the killing of her husband. "It seems to be," was the reply. When Anton closed his door, Bernice crept down the hall and listened. She waited there until the young man's light was extinguished. Then she realized that it was not his intention to trust her with the diamonds. You see, Anton had doubtless decided to deny everything, not knowing that the girl had been a witness of the murder. Then the burglars came. They had followed the diamonds from New York, and would have entered the house earlier, only that they understood that something unusual was in progress on the inside. During the absence of Anton in his stepfather's room, they had raised a ladder to a window of his room. One of them had looked through the window while Anton gloated over the diamonds. When the young man went to bed, the burglars entered the room, not knowing that Bernice was watching at the door, of course. Anton was not sound asleep, and sprang up at the noise they made. He was instantly grappled with, and finally knocked down, though not rendered entirely unconscious, with a pair of iron knuckles. While he lay on the floor, fearing for his life, the men, who had seen him enter the closet with the diamonds, searched about and secured the gems. All this time Bernice was listening at the door, afraid to call out for fear of inviting her own death at the hands of the burglars, resolved not to leave her post of observation, for the reason that she had not entirely given up the notion of securing the diamonds. She is a quick-witted girl, this French maid, and her brain was busy with a plan as she stood at the door in the dark hall. She regarded the arrival of the burglars as opportune. Their presence in the house would account for the murder and for the disappearance of the diamonds. Besides, she had a plan for securing the diamonds. When the burglars left Anton's room, she darted through it and climbed down the ladder in pursuit. Anton, though not fully recovered, knew who it was that was passing through without stopping to offer assistance, and at once decided that Bernice was in league with the robbers and had brought them to the house. Bernice followed the burglars to the railroad station. Here they met a third man, the agent of a diamond merchant, and she saw the diamonds placed in charge of the third man, locked in a trunk, and finally checked for passage on the train. I am still at a loss to know why this was done, but I think the merchant considered the gems safer there than in the pocket of any one of the three men. Now, Bernice had a lover on the train, which would carry the diamonds away, and that lover was no less a person than the baggage man in whose charge the diamonds were placed. When the train halted at the station, she called him from his car, told him what was going on, and the two went to where the three men were still haggling over the disposition of the diamonds. On the way to New York, this baggage man opened the trunk and stole the diamonds. The sailors believed that the agent stole them, the agent believed that the sailors gave him a counterfeit package, and Hartley, the merchant, sided with the agent. So you see, it all made a pretty mess. Yesterday in New York, continued Nick, the baggage man stored the diamonds in a deposit vault on Broadway, and when the train came through here not long ago, he handed the key to the box to Bernice. I have it here now. But the baggage man, he have escaped? Cried Bernice. I have nothing to do with it all. I am free, innocent. At that moment Nick was called to the telephone. Before leaving the room he turned to Anton and Bernice. I am going to leave you here, he said, although both are under arrest. I don't know but you will try to escape. If you do, it will be the worse for you both. Under the circumstances, if you behave well, I am inclined to be very lenient with you. Will you remain here until I return? They both promised. For the first time a gleam of hope shone in Anton's eyes. When Nick reached the phone, he found Chick at the other end. I have the baggage man under arrest, said the assistant. What does he say? He says that he did not know what the box contained. That may be true. Have you found out whether the diamonds are really in the vault? Asked Nick. It is impossible to locate the manager tonight, was the reply. How are things at your end? Everything lovely, was the reply. Come out on the first train. When Nick went back to the parlor, he handed Charlie the key to the safety box in the Broadway vaults. The baggage man is under arrest in New York, explained Nick. Perhaps you'd better go down on an early train and see if the diamonds are all right. He claims that he did not know what was in the box. He did not, said Bernice. I was not the fool to tell him. You may have made a mistake in not doing so, said Nick, for he might have left the package about in a careless manner. You have done several injudicious things in connection with this affair, added Nick. When you watched us from the hall on the morning following the murder, you attracted attention to yourself. When you came up and destroyed the footprints in the hall leading to the servants' rooms, you made yourself an object of suspicion. When you shot at us from the thicket in the orchard, you admitted, as plainly as words could have done, that you were deeply implicated in the robbery or the murder, or both. Under these circumstances, it was natural that you should be followed to the station, and your movements there noted. I saw the baggage man give you the key to the deposit box, and heard what you said to him. Your interview with him the night before was witnessed by the lunch man, although he could not hear what was said at the time. It was enough for me that you were there with him. So you see, you, yourself, supplied the clues which led to the location of the gems. What are you going to do with me now? Demanded the girl. I have done my work in the case, replied the detective. I have located the diamonds, and I have discovered how Alvin Maynard came to his death. The case is now in the hands of the sheriff and the state's attorney. Remember your promise to me, interrupted Mrs. Maynard. You promised not to be too hard on my son and Bernice if I told you what I knew of the affair. I shall recommend leniency, replied Nick, but I knew all the facts before you told me your story. The geologist's hammer with which the blow was struck was found in Anton's closet yesterday morning, but I did not remove it. I was not certain at that time that it was the instrument of death. During my absence in New York, the young man removed it, thus showing that he had an interest in concealing clues pointing to the murderer. Again, I learned on my first inspection of the closet that the stolen diamonds had, for a time, been secreted in a box in the closet. One of the gems had broken away from its fastening and was found in the box. The box and the diamond were also removed during my absence. Instead of covering up his tracks, the young man was only supplying more proof against himself. I think the burglars must have seen Anton carry the diamonds to the closet on his return from the front of the house, for they appeared to have found them with little trouble. "Are you going to turn me over to the sheriff?" asked Anton, his face deadly pale, his lips quivering, his brain whirling at the contemplation of the case against him. "I shall be obliged to do that," said Nick, "but I don't see how you can be convicted of murder, for you certainly had a right to strike when you believed your mother to be in peril. Bernice will be held as accessory after the fact only, for I shall not press the charge of attempted murder, though she might have killed Chick or myself. I shall be lenient for the sake of this poor old lady." At this moment a knocking was heard at the door, and Charlie admitted the sheriff. "I followed a false clue," he said to Nick. "What luck here?" "The diamonds have been recovered in New York," replied Nick, "and the death of Mr. Maynard is no longer a mystery. I have 2 prisoners here, Anton Sawtelle and Bernice. I ask you to take them into custody and keep them prisoners in this house until the state's attorney can be consulted." The detective did not consider it necessary to tell the whole story to the sheriff, but the latter consented to do as requested. In a few moments the house was dark, and Nick slept soundly until 8 o'clock in the morning, when he was awakened by Chick. "How are things in New York?" asked the chief. "Both Hartley and the bully murderer are under arrest," replied Chick, "and the sailor at the hospital is in a fair way to recover. He got a wicked blow, however." "They have run their course," said Nick. "The baggage man puts up the biggest yell," said Chick. "He says that he did not know that there had been a robbery, that he did not know that there were diamonds in the package, and that he only did a favor for Bernice." "When baggage men break open trunks as a favor to their sweethearts," said Nick, "it is time that they were called down." "It was a pretty mess," said Chick. "The burglars seemed to happen along just in time to turn suspicion from members of the household. Anton and Bernice put up the job to get the diamonds, all right, but Mrs. Maynard unconsciously foiled them for the time being." "I think Anton must be a bad sort of a chap," said Nick. "He would have robbed his friend of $500,000. "I'd like to know whether the baggage man put the diamonds in the safety box," said Chick, in a moment. "He might have opened the package, weakened its sight of so much wealth, and carried out the character of the case by putting a dummy package in the box." "Well," replied Nick, "the man is under arrest, but, for all that, it would not be so easy to again locate the diamonds." That morning the case was laid before the state's attorney, and Anton and Bernice were taken to the county jail. The diamonds were found in the safety vault, and Charlie recommended leniency in the case of the baggage man, who was charged with breaking baggage confided to his care. It proved to be the fact that he did not know what was in the trunk, and that he had been made to believe that Bernice had the right to have it opened. The wounded sailor recovered, and was sentenced to 1 year in the penitentiary for breaking and entering. His sentence was made light because he testified willingly against Hartley. He said that they had followed the diamonds from South Africa, and had applied to Hartley for funds immediately upon their arrival in New York. The one thing the sailor would not talk about was as to how they were able to interest Hartley in the venture in so short a time. They arrived on the vessel with the gems they were after, and in an hour's time they were working under the instructions of the diamond merchant. This part of the case was a mystery to all. Nick Carter was abroad at the time of the trial and sentence. Hartley, too, remained silent on this one point, even after he had received a sentence at Sing Sing, and the bully had been sent to the electric chair for the murder done at the store. "It was one of the strangest cases I ever handled," said Nick, after the matter was closed. "I came near getting a broken head there in the diamond store, but my usual luck protected me. There is one point, however, that I would like to see cleared up." "About how the sailors and Hartley got together so quickly?" "That's it. I have my suspicions, but they are vague." "Has Charlie Maynard disposed of the diamonds?" asked Chick. "He has not," was the reply. "I wish he would," added the detective soberly, "for it is not safe to have such a fortune in so small a parcel. The diamonds were followed from Africa. Who knows whether the leaders in the conspiracy have given up hope of securing them? Those sailors never put up that job." "I think I understand what your suspicions are regarding the combination between Hartley and the sailors, made in an hour," said Chick. "Well," said Nick, "it is the young man's own affair. I have advised him, but he only laughs at me." "Past experiences should teach him better," said Chick. And so it would seem. Chapter 9 Maynard's Folly. But past experiences did not prove of any advantage to Maynard, who still kept the diamonds in his possession, greatly to the surprise of his chum, Henry Townsend. "Do you mean that you have with you over $500,000 in diamonds, here on the Bowery at midnight?" asked Townsend, one night as they sat in a popular café in the Bowery. "That is the situation. I had an idea that the gems you were handling so carelessly were paste." "Not a bit of it. They are the real thing." "Your entire collection?" "The same." "Then you are running a fearful risk, especially when the visit of our nature to this part of the city is considered. How many members of the Dramatic Club know that you are carrying the diamonds in your pocket tonight?" "All of them, I take it. The gems were much admired." "Then you're a fool, Maynard. Why, it's simply tempting Providence. You alarm me." The men were taking a light luncheon in a rear room of the café. They had attended a dress rehearsal of a play, soon to be presented in the interest of charity, by a dramatic club of which they were both members. They were now waiting at the Bowery Café for the arrival of an acquaintance, one Julius Mantell by name, who was to conduct them to a private interview with a female fortune teller over whom the city was at that time in a craze. The appointment had been made that evening during the rehearsal already mentioned, and was for 2 o'clock at the woman's rooms, not far from the place where the young men waited. "I wish you hadn't mentioned the diamonds," said Maynard presently. "You have about spoiled my evening. It makes me nervous, now that you mention them, to think of their being here at this time." "I should think it would," said Townsend. "How did you come to do it?" "Oh, they are to be used during the play, you know, and this was the last full dress rehearsal, so I carried them down. Then, during the rehearsal, this appointment was made, unexpectedly, as you know, and I had to bring the gems with me or leave them there with the other properties." "They would have been safer there," urged Townsend. "We don't know what sort of a game we are going up against at the den of this African fortune teller. She is a mystery to the police, and is surrounded by a lot of servants who would, I actually believe, even do murder for her. We don't even know Mantell, who made the appointment for us at the hour of 2 in the morning, an unusual time, to say the least." "Yes, I know. He seems to have plenty of money, and is a good entertainer, but what else do we know about him? It will never answer, Maynard. You must get rid of those diamonds before we go to that woman's den." "But how?" "Let me carry them to the nearest respectable hotel and have them placed in the vault." "Oh, I need not trouble you to do that. I can go myself." "But it is a risk for you to go," said Townsend. "If you have been watched or followed, you would never get to the hotel, while no one would suspect me of having the diamonds. Pass them over while no one is in the room with us." "Pshaw!" cried Maynard. "You are making a mountain out of a molehill." "I have heard it said," continued Townsend, "that blood never washes off a diamond. The first night these gems were in America your uncle was murdered. A fine record those diamonds have! Come, let me be off with them. That is, if you can trust me with $500,000. "If you think it is as serious as all that," said Maynard, "I'll let you have them, but it looks like we were getting frightened at nothing." To be sure, Anton and Bernice were sentenced to short terms on the recommendation of Nick Carter, and are now both out. I saw Anton yesterday, but he came to the home of his mother and made all sorts of promises for the future. "And where is Bernice?" "She did not return to Aunt Maynard. I think, however, that Anton knows where she is, and will assist her if he succeeds in getting money from his mother." I don't like the pair, said Townsend, any more than I like the circumstances of the night. You certainly must get rid of the diamonds. I suppose so, but how? If we really are in danger, it is not safe for you to take them. Suppose we call a cab and both go to the Wisconsin. That's rather a neat little hotel over on Broadway. No, you remain here, and I'll walk there. You must see the necessity of not seeming to be going away for a purpose. All right, then, here are the diamonds. Hurry back. Young Maynard passed a rather bulky package to Townsend, and the latter hurried away. At the door of the room he paused and turned back. I'll go to the Wisconsin first, he said, and if there is no chance there, I'll go on up Broadway. You wait until I return. Townsend closed the door and walked through the outer room to the street. As he did so, a dark, lithe, muscular man of perhaps 30 years, who had been standing at the cigar case for a moment, stepped to the street door and spoke a few words to a man standing near. Then he turned to the cigar case again, and as he did so was accosted by a young man as dark and as sinister of face as himself. "Well?" asked the elder man. The young fellow took them off with him. "Where?" "To a hotel." "I see," said the other. "To the Wisconsin. Get a cab. Quick." "But the night is dark, and he is walking." "Never mind that now. Get a cab, pick up number 2 at the corner, and drive quickly to the Wisconsin. Number 2 knows what to do on arrival." The young man hastened away, and the other paid for a package of cigars he had ordered, and took his departure. Young Maynard waited half an hour for the return of his friend, but he did not come. As he was about to go in search of him, Julius Mantell entered the room. "I am late," said the fresh arrival, throwing himself into a chair, and ringing for an attendant. "I met a friend out here, and he steered me up against a jolly bunch that just let go of me. Where's Townsend?" "He was called away," replied Maynard, becoming every instant more anxious for his friend. "I am expecting him every moment." When the attendant arrived, Julius ordered brandy and cigars, and set out to make himself at home. He was a man of sallow skin and slender build. His eyes were dark and dull in repose, but they flashed like those of a snake under excitement. His nose was broad at the nostrils, his lips were thick, his hair jet black and curly. He spoke English with a slight French accent. Maynard had known him only a few weeks, having met him at the house of a mutual acquaintance. From that first day Mantell had seemed to court the acquaintance and companionship of the young millionaire. "Townsend is late," said Mantell presently. "We shall miss the appointment." Maynard could hardly retain his seat in his chair. He was fearful that his friend had come to some injury in his service. Surely he had been absent long enough to have executed his commission twice over. He was not thinking of the appointment. He was wondering how he could obtain news of his friend without exciting curiosity of the man sitting there. "Shall we go without him?" asked Julius after a time. "By no means," was the reply. "I shall wait for a few minutes, and then look him up if he does not return." "In that case," said the other, "we may as well call the appointment off. I am confoundedly sleepy, anyway. See you tomorrow." Mantell went away, and Maynard sprang for the phone. 2 millions in diamonds would have appeared as small to him as did the $500,000 involved when it came to a question of the safety of his friend. He began to understand now that he had made an awful mistake in carrying the diamonds about with him. At the phone he called up the Wisconsin hotel, asking for the clerk. When that rather important individual was on the wire, Maynard asked, "Was there a young man there within the hour asking to leave a package in the safe until morning?" "No," came the short reply. Maynard gave a brief description of his friend's personal appearance and asked, "Was such a person there for any purpose?" "Yes," was the reply. "Did he make his business known?" "He immediately went to one of the rooms in response to a call left at the desk for him," was the answer. Maynard experienced a feeling of relief, but only for a moment. "Is he there still?" he then asked. "He came down almost immediately and went away," was the reply. Maynard hung up the receiver, his face white and drawn. There was still much information to be asked at the hotel, but not by phone. "Something has happened," he thought. Townsend may be dead, for all I know. It was a horrible mistake to permit him to go away alone with the diamonds. Why should he go to a room at the Wisconsin and leave immediately? Why should he keep me here in suspense when he understood how anxious I was as to the result of his mission? I can never solve the problem alone. I wonder if it is possible to reach Mr. Carter tonight. I wonder if he will come." The excited young man called the detective's private number and waited with wildly beating heart. Presently a response came over the wire. "Is Mr. Carter there?" he asked. "Talking," was the reply, much to Maynard's relief. In a few words Maynard explained the exact situation. "I may be unnecessarily alarmed," he said, "but I feel that something ought to be done at once. Can you come?" "Immediately," was the prompt response, and Maynard hung up the receiver to walk and worry until the detective laid a hand on his shoulder. Chapter 10 A Fatal Errand "Now tell me about it," said Nick, as soon as they gained the seclusion of a private room. Maynard told the story of the night, not sparing himself in the least. The detective looked very grave. "Is it serious?" asked the young man. "I am afraid so," was the reply, "but hope for the best. We can do nothing here, so we may as well go to the Wisconsin at once." While Maynard was cheered by the presence of the great detective, he realized that Nick's willingness to respond to his call meant that the detective feared more than the loss of the diamonds. He would hardly have left his bed at that hour simply for the purpose of recovering diamonds which had been carelessly lost track of. Arrived at the hotel, the detective made himself known to the clerk, that being the surest way of securing the attention he required. The clerk was at once all smiles, ready to answer all questions, to do anything in his power to accommodate the famous detective, whose appearance at the hotel was forever afterwards spoken of as a notable event. "First," said Nick, "we must learn whether it was really Townsend who came here. Describe the young man you have reference to." "Medium build," began the clerk, "brown hair, light mustache, blue eyes, Roman nose, very fair complexion." "That is the man," said Maynard. "Wait," said Nick. "How was he dressed?" "Suit of blue basket cheviot, sack coat, vest cut high, dark brown derby hat, wing collar, blue 4-in-hand tie with red threads in it, small diamond pin on the tie, long cuffs with amethyst buttons, diamond ring on the little finger of the left hand." "That was Townsend," said Maynard. "You ought to have been a detective," said Nick to the clerk. "Now show us to the room to which he was taken." "But the message which called him to the room," suggested Maynard. "What about that? Who sent it, and from what place was it sent?" "That we may learn of the man whom he visited," said Nick, and the three took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The halls were well lighted, but seemed deserted, and they were alone in the elevator, with the exception of the boy operator. "The man who took the room seems to be awake," said the clerk, pointing to the transom over the door of room 43. "There is a light inside." The clerk knocked on the panel of the door, but there was no response. "Perhaps he is asleep," said the clerk. "I'll try him again." There was no response to the second summons, and the detective took out his picklock. In a moment the door flew open. Nick stepped inside, then turned and faced Maynard in the doorway. His face was paler than usual, but there was no excitement in his manner. "Wait a moment," he said to the young man. "Prepare yourself for a shock before you step into the room." "Who is there?" whispered Maynard, who seemed to have lost the power of loud speech. "Is he ill?" The clerk brushed by the two men, and advanced to a table which stood at the center of the room, and at which a figure clad only in white underclothing was half sitting, half lying, with arms resting on the top. "Ill!" cried the clerk, in a tone of horror. "The man is dead!" Maynard sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. He knew only too well the form at the table. Nick turned to the clerk and asked: "Is this the young man who was summoned to this room by a call?" "Yes," was the hoarse reply. "But you stated that he left the hotel almost immediately." "Someone left," was the horrified reply, "and that someone wore the clothes I described to you. See!" This young man has been stripped, and there are the clothes of the man who made the exchange." There could be no doubt about it. The dead man at the table was Townsend. The grief of Maynard was pitiful. "If I had only taken my chances with the diamonds," he muttered. "Poor Townsend! To come to this at last! It was all my fault, Mr. Carter. I sent him to his death." "The diamonds?" echoed the clerk. "Does this mean robbery as well as murder?" "That remains to be seen," replied the detective. As Nick spoke, he lifted from the floor a small square of oiled silk, red in color. He held it up for the inspection of Maynard. "Were the diamonds wrapped in this?" he asked. Maynard nodded. "That is only part of the wrapping," he said. "Were the diamonds of great value?" asked the clerk. $500,000 was the short reply. Nick now regarded the jewels as a small part of the case. The thing to do was to locate and punish the murderer of Henry Townsend. The clerk stepped back in wonder. "He should have left them in the safe," he said. "That is what he came here to do," said the detective. "Now, before the coroner or the police are notified, I must search this room for some clue to the identity of the murderer. But first, tell me everything you know regarding the occupant of this room, the person who murdered this poor boy and walked out of the hotel dressed in the victim's clothes. When was the room taken?" "Not 10 minutes before the young man you call Townsend came." Maynard sprang to his feet. "Then the murderer knew where Townsend was going when he set off on foot from the café, knew where he was going and what he carried, and laid a trap for him," he cried. "What was said?" asked Nick. "He came to the desk and asked if any one had called for Martin Haines. I said that there had been no such party asked for. Then he said he had a message for a friend of his who might call there during the night. If he did call, he was to be sent up to room 43. When Townsend came in, I gave him the message, and he went up at once. I don't know what the message was." "Townsend said nothing about leaving a parcel in the safe when he came in?" "No, sir. He seemed surprised at the message and went straight to the elevator." "How was the person who took this room dressed?" "All in black, including hat, tie, and frock coat. He was a dusky sort of fellow, with black eyes and hair, just about Townsend's size." "Not like Townsend in feature or complexion?" "Not in the least," replied the clerk slowly, with a look of perplexity growing on his face. "I can see now," he added, "how mistaken I was in supposing that it was Mr. Townsend who left the hotel. I can't understand, however, how I came to be so careless, for it is my duty to know what goes on here at night." "I presume that you did not notice the person who went out, except generally, and were deceived by the clothes worn," said Nick. "Of course, that is it," was the reply, "but all the same, I don't make many mistakes like that. I couldn't keep my job if I did." "And the person who engaged the room gave the name of Martin Haines?" asked the detective. "Yes, sir." "Register?" "Yes, sir." "Any baggage?" "No, sir," replied the clerk. "He paid in advance for one night, and nothing was said about baggage." "Who occupied this room yesterday?" "A young man who comes here once a week, usually Thursday. He travels for a wholesale house." "Does he always have this room?" "Oh, no, sir." "Then he does not leave his clothing or toilet articles here?" "He does not." "How long since a woman has occupied the room?" The clerk pondered a moment. "At least 2 weeks," he replied, at length. "It may be more than that." "That is all for the present," said Nick. "We'll come down presently and look at this Mr. Haines's signature on the register. By the way, was it a very stout person?" "On the contrary, he was a very slender man," replied the clerk. "Mustache?" asked Nick. "Yes, sir. A black mustache." "Hands, large or small?" "Quite small, sir, and sparkling with a fine ring." "Diamond?" asked the detective. "Yes, sir. The real thing." "Send in the night elevator boy when you go out," said Nick. CHAPTER 11. A Startling Discovery. The clerk passed out of the room with an offended air. He was loath to leave the presence of the great detective without gaining some notion as to his course of action in the murder case. The elevator boy soon made his appearance, and Nick asked, "You have been on duty all night?" "Yes, sir." "You carried a slender, dark-faced person up to this room an hour or so ago?" "Yes, sir." Nick looked at his watch. The hands pointed to the hour of 2. "Can you tell me the exact time?" he asked. "It was 10 minutes past 1 when I left the office for the elevator," was the reply. "Did the person speak to you on the way up?" "Yes, sir," was the reply. "He asked me about the fire escape and the stairs winding about the elevator well. Seemed afraid of fire." "About the voice, harsh or soft?" "Soft and low, sir." "Yes, yes. And when did that person go down again?" "I don't know, sir. He did not go down in the cage." "Did you see the person going down?" "No, sir." "Did you see him pass through the office?" "No, sir. It was late, and I guess I was asleep in the elevator." "You saw the young man who came to this room?" "The brown-haired one? Yes, sir." Nick pointed to the silent figure in the chair at the table. The boy stepped forward and peered into the dead man's face. "Gee!" he cried, springing toward the door. "Why didn't you tell me he was dead? Did that other feller kill him?" "That is what we are trying to find out," said Nick. "Now, when this young man came up in the elevator, did he say anything to you?" "Yes, he asked me if I knew the party in 43." "And you?" "I told him that I did not. I had seen him only once." "Is that all he said?" "Yes, sir." "How did he act?" "Queer, I thought. When he stepped out of the cage, he turned back again, as if he thought of going back down with me. Once or twice he clutched his left side, up there by the inside pocket." "I wish he had gone down again!" cried Maynard, starting from his chair. "He lost his life by going on. Can nothing be done, Mr. Carter? Is he past all hope of recovery?" Nick dismissed the elevator boy and turned to the agitated young man. "Don't give way to your emotions now," he said. "We have much to do if the murderer is ever brought to justice and the diamonds recovered." "Never mind the diamonds," said Maynard. "I wish I had never set eyes on them. First my poor uncle and now my best friend. The devil is in the diamonds. I hope I shall never see them again." "Are you strong enough to remain here while I take a look at the body in the room? If not, you would better sit in the office." "Oh, yes, I'll remain here. Poor Henry! You don't know what it is to lose a chum like that." Nick approached the body and lifted the head from the table. There was no blood in sight, but just over the heart was a faint stain. The detective opened the shirt and saw a tiny puncture in the breast. The dead man had been stabbed with some slender weapon. The wound was exactly over the heart. Nick gazed long and thoughtfully at the still figure. He did not understand how the wound could have been made so exactly over the vital spot. If Townsend had resisted, such a mode of murder would have been impossible. Then a light came to the wondering detective. He bent forward and laid his face close to that of the dead man. "I thought so," he then muttered. "What is it?" asked Maynard. A spray of chloroform was thrown into Townsend's face, and the wound was made while he was dazed, if not quite unconscious. But if the murderer had him under the influence of the drug, why did he not permit the drug to do the work? This stabbing seems brutal and unnecessary. "I can't understand that part of it myself," said Nick. "However, we shall know more of the details before long." "What sort of a weapon was it?" asked Maynard. "The cut is a tiny one." "It might have been made with a hat pin," said Nick. "Men don't carry hat pins about with them," said Maynard. "This murder," replied Nick, "was committed by a woman." "A woman?" echoed Maynard. "Exactly, by a woman disguised as a man. That may be why the young man was dazed with a spray of chloroform before the fatal blow was struck. The woman was not strong or daring enough to take the risk of determined resistance." "But how do you know that it was a woman who was here? The clerk said nothing about that." The clerk was deceived. "See here! This blue ribbon comes from the front of a woman's undervest. In the haste of dressing in Townsend's clothes, the ribbon broke and she tossed it aside. There are other things that tell me it was a woman, sure enough." "Think of a woman doing a thing like this!" cried Maynard. "Horrible crimes have been committed by women," said Nick, laying the cast-off clothing of the murderer on the table and drawing up a chair. "There's nothing in the pockets," he finally said. "Not a blessed thing. Now for the tailor. Ah!" "What is it?" asked Maynard, as Nick gave a start of surprise. "The clothes," he said, "were made in Paris by Monsieur Dumont. Here is the mark of the firm on the inner side of the collar. Careless thing to leave that mark here. It tells a great deal." "I see no name there," said Maynard. "Of course not," said the detective. "But the trademark of the firm is here. I have seen it before under similar circumstances. Dumont makes clothes for actors, and has also been nicknamed the thieves' tailor. In other words, he makes duplicates, imitations, disguises, and all sorts of trick garments. He is known by the better class of rascals the world over." "Then we can easily learn the name of the person who ordered this suit." Chapter 12 The Hustling Reporter Nick smiled at the simplicity of the young man. "Dumont has a reputation for keeping his mouth shut," he said, "and that is the reason he has built up such a profitable business. Go to him tomorrow with this suit, trademark and all, and he will swear that the trademark is a forgery and that he never saw the clothes before." "Do you think the woman came to America in quest of these diamonds?" asked Maynard. Nick did not reply immediately. He was examining a comb and brush which lay upon a dresser at the head of the bed. "Look here," he finally said, turning to Maynard with a brush and comb in his hand. "The woman could not resist the temptation to print before the mirror, and she left hairs in the brush and the comb." Maynard took the brush into his hand. "What do you see there?" asked Nick. "Not black hairs, certainly. Short red hairs." "Exactly." "But this person was dark," insisted Maynard. "At least so described by the clerk." "Also described by the clerk as a man," said Nick, with a smile. "How do you know that these hairs were not left here by some former occupant of the room?" asked the young man. "Because," was the reply, "she combed her hair, after removing her black wig, before she removed her clothes. There were short red hairs on the collar of the coat she wore." "A red-haired woman," mused Maynard. "Very slender and with black eyes," added Nick. "She couldn't color her eyes, you know, and the clerk said they were black. We may also add a very nice white complexion." Nick went to the washstand in the corner of the room and pointed to a black sediment on the sides of the bowl. The piece of toilet soap which lay on the marble top was also rimmed with black. The interior of the bowl and the surface of the soap were still moist. "There is where she washed off her face stain," said Nick. "So we have a slender, red-haired, fair-complexioned woman, about 5'3", according to the clothes, with very small feet and hands." "How do you know about the feet and hands?" asked the young man. "The woman slopped water from the bowl as she washed," was the reply, "and it fell on the carpet and over her shoes. See, the spot where this foot stood is dry. The carpet is wet, and the dry spot represents a very small shoe." "We started in with a dark-complexioned male murderer," said Maynard, "and now we have come to a fair-faced woman with red hair, and clothes made in Paris." "You asked me a moment ago," said Nick, "if I thought this woman came across the Atlantic in quest of these diamonds, and I made no reply. Now, I can tell you that it is possible that she did, and that she did not come alone." "A conspiracy for robbery?" "That is about the size of it, as it looks now." "Do you think this affair in any way connected with the former larceny of the diamonds, when they were followed from South Africa?" "There is little doubt of it," was the reply. "Who was with you tonight besides the dead man?" "Why, I was at rehearsal, as I told you at first. That is the way the diamonds came to be with me. They were to be used in the play, you know." "And the members of the club knew that you had them with you?" "Of course. They admired them vastly." "And who did you talk with about them, especially, I mean?" Julius Mantell, I think." "Who is he?" "A recent acquaintance from Paris, and a member of the club. During the rehearsal he made an appointment with me." "Where were you going?" "Why, I told you about that. To the African fortune tellers. We had a date for 2:00, and we waited at the café, Townsend and I, for Julius to come." "He did not arrive until after Townsend left?" "No, he went home with one of the ladies." "Had you talked with Julius, as you call him, about the African fortune teller before tonight? You mean the fortune teller out on East Houston Street?" "Oh, yes, he had long promised to secure a private séance for Townsend and I, and tonight the chance came. What do you know of Julius Mantell?" "Nothing." "Is he in business?" "He is just a globe-trotter, I think." "Plenty of money?" "I think so. He never borrows." "How long have you known him?" "About 3 months." "He came from Paris to New York?" "So I am informed. That must be the clerk coming back, and there seems to be someone with him. I wonder if he called the police?" The next moment the door was thrust open, and the clerk, accompanied by a youth of breezy manners, swung into the room. Nick looked at them sternly, for he was not patient when disturbed at his work. "What do you want?" he asked. The young man, who was red-headed, freckle-faced, and the owner of a perennial smile, advanced toward the detective. "I am to blame for the intrusion," he said. "I'm a reporter, and want to know all about this murder and the loss of the diamonds. Which is Mr. Charles Maynard, and which is Mr. Nicholas Carter, the famous detective?" "Ah! The coroner has not been called as yet. Here is the body of the murdered man. What luck! Now, if you will stand aside, I'll take a snapshot of it." The young man began arranging a camera which he carried in his coat pocket. Nick took him by the back of the neck and landed him outside the door. "Now, keep out of here," he said. "And you, too," he added, turning to the clerk. "Oh, you can't stop the press!" shouted the reporter, pounding on the door. "I've got the story right here, and another one to boot. Young girl mysteriously murdered half an hour ago in a tenement on East Houston Street. Beautiful girl. I took her picture." Nick opened the door. "Come in here and tell me about it," he said. "Oh, you have thought out, have you?" said the young man. "Well, I don't know much about the case. The girl had been out during the night, I take it. Anyway, there was a row, and the girl was stabbed. The people of the tenement declare they had a row over diamonds, or something of that sort. I'm going back there right now. Want to come with me?" "It may have some connection with this case," whispered Maynard to the detective. "Diamonds in the case, you know." "I was just thinking of that," said Nick, "but I am not entirely satisfied that this young man is just what he pretends to be." "I might go back with him and find out," suggested Maynard. For a moment Nick made no reply. Chapter 13. Into the Trap. "No," said the detective presently. "I think I'd better go myself, though it may be a trap. Hold these people here while I slip down to the phone." During the absence of the detective, the red-headed young man moved swiftly about the room. To Maynard he seemed to be looking for something. He hung constantly in the vicinity of the chair upon which the murderer's clothing had been placed after the exchange of garments. Once or twice he got down on the floor and examined the carpet. Maynard thought this remarkable, but said nothing. When Nick returned from the phone booth and the young man was still busy in his search of the room, Maynard explained his actions to the detective, who smiled and said not a word in reply. "Well, I've got to get a move on," said the young fellow, in a moment. "Are you chaps coming with me?" "We must wait for the coroner," replied Nick. And so they waited, while the young man fumed up and down. Nick turned to the clerk again, motioning him into the hall, where he followed. When Townsend entered the office, he asked, "How did you know that he was the one this Martin Haines had asked for?" "Oh, Haines gave me a description and a name." This set Nick to thinking on new lines for a moment. Then he said, "While we are waiting for the coroner, we may as well go to the office and inspect the signature." Leaving Maynard and the reporter in the room, Nick and the clerk descended to the office. The signature, when inspected through a powerful glass, proved to be a very ordinary one, but Nick made certain that it was written by a woman. "How did that reporter get in here?" asked Nick. "I suspect that the elevator boy gave him a tip," was the reply. Nick called the boy, who looked confused, and neither admitted nor denied the accusation. Presently a deputy coroner arrived, and Nick accompanied him to room 43. While the reporter was asking him impossible questions, Nick took the clothing left by the murderer to the office and left it with the clerk, carefully wrapped. "Give that to no one," he said. "I will call for the package in person." Then the reporter and Maynard came down the elevator, and the former started off. "I'm going," he said. "Come along." "Shall I come?" whispered Maynard. "It is a trap," said Nick, "and you may as well go home so as to be fit tomorrow." "Why do you say it is a trap?" "Because that chap is not a reporter." "How do I know?" "If he was a reporter, he would have telephoned in something for the first edition the minute he saw the body, without waiting for anything more. Besides, what has he learned about the dead man or the circumstances of the murder?" "But if it is a trap, why do you go?" "Because, if it is a trap, it is set by the murderer or some of her confederates, and going with this young man will place me in touch with the gang." "But it is dangerous." "All my work is dangerous." "Why don't you take officers with you?" "I shall not be alone," replied Nick significantly, and turned away with the red-headed young fellow. As the detective and his young companion passed out at the square of light in front of the hotel, Maynard, standing irresolute at the window, saw two men who had been hidden in a stairway across Broadway leave their shelter and follow them. Alarmed at the occurrence, Maynard stepped out into the street and passed on in the direction taken by the detective, the reporter, and their pursuers. He saw them turn east, and then they were lost to his sights. With a heavy heart the young millionaire returned to the hotel. Policemen were standing guard out in the hall. There was a door connecting room 43 with 44. Maynard secured the latter room and threw himself on the bed. He lay for a long time listening to the talk of the officers, but finally fell into an uneasy slumber. When he woke again there was a bright light in 43. His door was a trifle ajar, and he could hear voices in the room where the dead man lay. He arose and stepped toward the door. Then a voice that he knew came to his ears. It was the voice of a woman. "I think we've settled Nicholas for good and all," she said. "That was a clever thought." Maynard started back in terror. What was that woman doing there, in the room with his murdered chum? Why should she desire to see the detective come to harm? Maynard actually pinched himself to see if he was not dreaming. But what he heard was a reality, vast enough. Had this woman whose voice he heard taken any part in the murder? While the young man puzzled over the matter, another voice reached his ears. "Yes, Nick will trouble us no more," it said. "He went up against the wrong bunch this time." This voice was as familiar to Maynard as the other, only it was a man's voice. He could not figure it out. Why should these people be here, and why was the room open at all? Had Nick Carter come to harm? With this thought prominent in his mind, Maynard moved toward the doorway. In the half light of the room he stumbled over a rocker and fell heavily to the floor. Before he could get on his feet again he heard quick steps rushing into the room, saw a blaze of light from the doorway, saw, also, two faces that he knew, rage and apprehension showing upon them. Then he called out, saw an uplifted arm, heard a wrathful voice, and a blow descended. When the officers came to 43 in the early morning, they found the door to 44 open. Entering, they found Maynard lying on the floor with a frightful wound in his head and a stab in the region of the heart. Room 43 gave many evidences of having been searched thoroughly. Even the carpet had been loosened in places. The body of Townsend, however, had been in no wise disturbed. Maynard was conveyed to his hotel, and the dead man taken to the residence of his parents. "If Maynard lives," the doctor said, "it will be a wonder. He was left for dead. The clue to the murderer which he had stumbled on was of no avail at that time, for what he knew might never aid in the detection of the criminals. The wound on the head, the doctor said, was liable to produce a lapse of memory which would go further back than the night on which it was received. In the meantime, Nick Carter was satisfied that Maynard had gone to his rooms from the hotel, and would remain there until the next day. As he walked down the street with the self-styled reporter, the detective listened between steps for a sound he hoped to hear not far away. No such sound came to his ears. Presently he found himself in Houston Street. The house occupied by the African fortune-teller with whom Maynard and Townsend had made an appointment was not far away. Nick knew the place well, for, as much out of curiosity as anything, he had called upon the woman when she had first attracted the attention of the town, and had made a close scrutiny of her apartments, which were on the first floor of an old residence not far from the East River. There was a red light over the door, but the building seemed still, and the window shades were closely drawn. The young man stopped directly in front of the house. "This is the place," he said. Again Nick listened for the expected footfalls, but in vain. There was nothing for it but to go in alone and trust to luck. He had summoned Chick and Patsy from his home when he had called the coroner, instructing them to hasten to the hotel and trail him wherever he went. Something had possibly happened to disarrange the plan. Chapter 14. The Great Diamond Syndicate. "Are you coming in?" asked the alleged reporter. "The girl I told you of is in the rear room on the second floor." Nick made a quick decision. "Go ahead," he said. He knew that he was entering a trap, and that his life would be in danger, but he had no thought of turning back. The young man rang the bell, and in a moment the door was open, showing the interior of a plainly furnished hallway from which a flight of stairs led to a floor above. The place was illuminated only by the red hanging lamp which showed through the transom over the street door, and the general appearance was mysterious. Somehow the atmosphere of the room carried out the impression given by the light. The first impulse on entering was to flee from some unseen peril. There was a strong odor of musk about the place, and this seemed, to the vivid imagination, to conceal the presence of something uncanny. As the two entered the hallway, they were met by a stalwart servant in the regulation dress coat and white vest. There was something sinister in the fellow's face as he barred the way to the staircase. He spoke in French. "Why are you here?" "This is an officer," replied the young man. "We have come to see the body of the girl who was killed here not long ago." The servant pointed up the staircase, saying, "We have nothing to conceal from the police. First door to the left." The two started on up the stairs, the young fellow in the lead. Nick was watchful and ready with a revolver, which was hidden within easy reach under his coat. He understood the peril of the situation, but trusted to his usual good luck to get him out of any complications that might arise. He was now satisfied that the secret of Townsend's death lay in that house, and he was determined to uncover it. But the detective had no opportunity to use his weapon. The forces with which he was contending were keener than he supposed. Halfway up the staircase, a spray of chloroform struck him in the face, blinding him and sending him to the floor in an unconscious condition. This was a form of attack upon which he had not figured. When he regained consciousness, he was lying, securely bound as to hands and feet, on a leather couch in a room which looked like an ordinary business office. There were two windows, evidently facing the street, for the shades were drawn over the panes, and inside blinds still further shut out the view. There were three doors to the room, one from the hall through which he concluded he had been carried, a second connecting with what must be a small front room over the lower hall, and one connecting with a rear apartment. In the matter of furniture, the room was supplied with two curtain-top desks, two swivel chairs, and the leather couch upon which the detective found himself. A gas log blazed in a grate opposite the hall door. At first Nick's head buzzed badly, but he soon recovered. Then his eyes fell on the figure of a man sitting at a desk in the front of the room. The fellow was lean and muscular, with a large head, remarkably flat on top, and keen black eyes. As Nick looked him over, he swung around in his chair. "You are coming too, eh?" he said. "That dose would have finished an ordinary man. How are you feeling?" "Never better," replied Nick. "You seem to be quite comfortable here." "Yes, we are fairly well fixed here, though our London office is more luxurious." Nick had no idea where he was. The man he was talking with looked and acted like a businessman, absorbed in his work. There was nothing suspicious or terrifying about the apartment. In fact, the leather thongs which bound him were the only evidences that he was not in an ordinary place of business. "This is a new one on me," said the detective presently. "What became of the young fellow who brought me here?" "He has gone out to see about another matter," was the reply. "Remarkable man, that. You believed him to be a reporter?" "I certainly did not," replied Nick. "I understood that I was walking into a trap, but thought I could trust to luck." "And you are still trusting to luck?" "Certainly. I shall get out in some way." "You have no idea where you are?" "On Houston Street, I presume," replied Nick, wondering if the men he had ordered on duty had located the house he entered. "Streets do not matter," said the other. "It is the place that counts. This looks all regular, doesn't it?" The fellow glanced about the room with evident pride. "It looks all right," said Nick. "What is the game?" "It is the office of the Great Diamond Syndicate," was the reply. "Or a branch office, rather, for the main establishment is in London." "You have the Maynard diamonds here, I presume?" asked Nick. "They are not far away," was the reply. "The syndicate steals diamonds, eh?" asked Nick. "Acquires diamonds," corrected the other. "And plans a cowardly murder now and then?" continued Nick. "We do not consider the means," was the reply. "We look only to results. We are organized in the regular way and pay very large dividends. Men organize to secure lands and other things without paying for them. Why shouldn't we organize to acquire diamonds? We don't aim to commit violence. In fact, we are a very respectable institution. You will find us rated in the commercial agencies." "The fellow intends to murder me," thought Nick, "else he would not be so free with the affairs of the concern." "We have offices and agents in all the large cities," continued the fellow, "and are doing a fine business. Whenever a rare collection of gems is made, we list it. From that time we are on the lookout to acquire it. Let me give you an illustration of our methods. The diamonds which you call the Maynard diamonds were collected in South Africa. The collection was reported at our London office. We sent 2 men out to Cape Town to get them, but they did not succeed. The diamonds were sold to a man who shipped them to this country. Our men followed on the same ship, and reported to our agent here. They got them in New York, but lost them again. One of these men was killed, the other is serving time, as you know. Then this young man Maynard got the diamonds back through your efforts. He has been followed by 2 of our best men for a year, so you see that the collection has cost us quite a tidy sum of money." "Quite enterprising, I'm sure," said Nick. "How many people have you put out of the way in your quest for the Maynard diamonds?" "I don't confess to any crime," was the reply. "I think, on the whole, that we are very considerate in our methods. Why, we acquire plenty of collections without wasting a drop of blood. There was the Harvard collection, 2 millions, the Gould lot, 1 million, the Montrevel collection, 500,000, the Burns lot, 1 million. Not a drop of blood shed, no one arrested, and the diamonds shipped away. You can see for yourself that we are doing the best we can with a peculiar business. We have our agents in all grades of society." "Even in dramatic clubs," said Nick. "Even in dramatic clubs," repeated the other with a smile. "We really enjoyed the chase after the Maynard diamonds." "You seem to be enjoying the present situation," said Nick. "How long are you to keep me in this uncomfortable position?" "Why, the fact is," said the other, "that we are waiting for a report from a man who was sent to your residence 2 hours ago. You see, you have a collection of gems which is listed at 500,000 in the office of the Great Diamond Syndicate in London. You have put us to so much trouble and expense that we thought best to acquire this collection, and a man has gone up after it. He is to search the steel vault off your sleeping room and all available parts of the house. If he can do so, he will accomplish his work without bloodshed. But you have trained your people to resist coercion, and there may be a fight. I sincerely hope that no member of your family will be injured." "We are doing this thing for 2 reasons," continued the other. "In the first place, you were sentenced to death in London not long ago, and cannot long enjoy the possession of the diamonds. In the second place, we thought best to demonstrate to you, previous to your death, that you detectives are, on the whole, rather cheap people. You go about with your picklock and your electric torch, and think you are the whole thing. Now you see how hopeless you are in the hands of a syndicate of brainy and determined men." "And if the man at my house does not find the diamonds?" asked Nick dryly. "Then you will be required to write an order for their delivery to this place." Nick shut his teeth with a snap. "You won't, eh?" said the other. "Pardon me, but I think you will. We have means of persuasion here. What do you think of our methods by this time?" "Of course you have planned my death?" asked Nick. "Of course," was the reply. "Do you think I would talk so freely with a man who was to be permitted to live? Then, if I am to die, anyway, why should I comply with your wishes in the matter of the diamonds?" Chapter 14. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona.